Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 138 to 159. Chapter 138. Are there any questions? A couple of days had passed since the battle in the trenches, and Berengar was growing anxious. He did not yet know when Lothar would fall, and he was trying to rush his campaign as quickly as possible. Eventually, the wall came crumbling down, and when it did, he ordered a full storming of the city. Covered by artillery fire and continuous volleys of the rifled muskets, line infantry and levies alike rushed into the gap into the wall, using whatever methods available to them to take the city. Despite the fierce assault, the defenders of the city of Trent were undeterred. Though the prince-bishop had successfully fled, it was their duty to defend the city with their lives. Hopefully, if they did so, they could enter the gates of heaven. After all, in the eyes of the city's defenders, they were fighting against a horde of heathens who sought to bring down Christendom. Religion was a powerful tool, and the weak-minded were easily compelled to die by the propaganda of the church. Yet despite the zealotry of the forces who gave up their lives to defend against the besiegers, they quickly realized that they were vastly outnumbered. Levies crashed with men-at-arms, and line infantry fired their muskets in concentrated volleys onto the enemy positions. Blood and guts spilled across the snowy streets as the defending garrison was pushed further and further back into the city. Those more cowardly hostiles would hide in the homes of civilians, which Berengar would immediately order their clearing. Not willing to risk the lives of his soldiers, a grenade or two were lobbed into the room before busting down the door, usually resulting in not only the death of the defender but also the civilians who cowered in their homes. As the battle raged on, the lords who had submitted to Berengar's authority saw the tactics Berengar was using and were quite confused. They knew Berengar had an order not to kill unarmed civilians needlessly. Yet, here, his troops were lobbing explosives into the rooms which clearly contained such people. As such, they inquired to Berengar why he was breaking his own rules of war. Berengar stared stoically onto the battlefield, alongside the lords of the levies who entered the city alongside him. Violence, blood, and despair quickly spread to every corner of the city. Enemies' lives were taken, and many civilians were caught in the crossfire. As Berengar gazed upon the sight, he continued his lecture on the art of war for all the nearby noblemen to hear. My rules of war can be summed up in a single phrase. Victory at any cost. If civilians are caught in the crossfire between two combatants, then so be it. If civilians were to take up arms and rise against me in the act of rebellion, I would take 10 heads for every rebel to prove a point. Kneel before me, or die. Those are your two choices. With those words spoken, the lords who had submitted to Berengar felt chills down their spines. However, before they could protest, Berengar began to continue his speech. For example, say there is a village, and within this village, there is a garrison of enemy soldiers or a group of rebels who have taken up arms against me, but also in the village, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of unarmed civilians who may or may not express support for the hostile forces. I have no qualms ordering a bombardment of the town and razing it to the ground to ensure the destruction of my enemies, especially if it will spare the lives of my soldiers. Berengar's concept of warfare stemmed from the fact that he was well educated on the history of warfare and tactics, as well as the fact that in his previous life, he had witnessed many young men in the service of the American armed forces losing their lives in Afghanistan, where they might have been spared if the Pentagon was not so concerned about civilian casualties. As long as a region resisted the rule of the occupying nation, in Berengar's eyes, it was considered an active war zone, and whatever cruelty was needed to bring the war to an end was completely justified. The battle continued to wage on, but this time Berengar was not at the front lines. Instead, he lectured the nobles about his vision of warfare and which extents were justifiable and unjustifiable in the pursuit of victory. As such, Berengar decided to move on to the actions he had restricted. As long as there is resistance in a region, it is a war zone, and any measure necessary to achieve a swift victory is justifiable. However, if the enemy surrenders, they should be afforded proper dignity unless, of course, they are rebels. Rebellions cannot be tolerated, and a brutal show of force is necessary to crush the spirit of those who believe in their cause. As for the civilians in the region, once the fighting has ended, no harm should be brought to them, for at that point, you have successfully conquered the region, and they are now your subjects. There are exceptions to this, but that revolves around a series of political actions, mainly regarding colonialism, and I will not get into the complexity of that topic at this moment. As Berengar brought his rant to a close, the lords gazed upon the city, which was lit ablaze by explosives. When combined with the corpses of the enemy soldiers, and the civilians caught in the crossfire whose blood flowed into the snow-covered streets, created an image of Armageddon. When witnessing such destruction and death, Berengar turned around to face the lords with a chilling smile on his otherwise immaculate visage before asking them the question on his mind. Are there any questions? The several lords who had submitted to Berengar's authority and allied with him to crush the southern rebellion shook their heads in silence, with a look of horror spread across their faces. For a man to be smiling in the face of such a chaotic scene, only a monster would be able to do such a thing. Or so they thought, though Berengar was happy that his plans were progressing. Internally, he could not help but sigh to himself at the needless loss of life. If his enemies were not so stubborn and surrendered the city to him the moment the walls came down, the region's citizens would not have suffered to such a degree. Of course, the lords had no way of knowing what Berengar was thinking inside the labyrinth that was his mind, and as such, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, inspiring them to never take up arms against the man in front of them, for in their minds Berengar was a demon in the flesh of a man. Chapter 139 Lothar's Defeat. It had been over a week since the siege of Trent, and the entire region fell into Berengar's hands, but to Count Lothar, who was trapped in Vienna with no way out, he had no way of knowing that he had completely lost the home front. At this point, he was desperate to escape the city and flee towards his home, where he planned to rally the local forces and defend Innsbruck until every man, woman, and child had expended their lives in its defense. He would do whatever was necessary to ensure his own survival for as long as possible. Count Otto's forces had broken through the gates, and the city was once more thrust into chaos as Otto and his men began fighting their way through the battle-worn soldiers of Lothar's army, or what remained of it. Count Lothar, at the moment, was battling with a knight under Otto's command who was clad in full steel-plate armor. The two men were both similarly equipped. However, Lothar was at a disadvantage. At the moment, he only had a longsword in his hands, which was not the most effective weapon against a knight encased in full plate. As for the knight, held a halberd in his hands and had a sword sheathed on his waist. Lothar wielded his sword with excellent skill, deflecting the oncoming blows of the polearm and rushing forward, trying to get into the gaps between the enemy armor. However, the knight was equally adept and had a significant advantage in reach. Before Lothar knew it, he found himself being pushed back by the knight's advance. Luckily for him, some of his nearby men rushed forward to aid him. However, when they arrived to help their lord, they soon realized that he had disappeared. The moment the men had come to his aid and began to distract the knight, Lothar ran off in the opposite direction in a desperate attempt to flee from the city. Lothar did not have time to disguise himself. War was waging around him, and enemy forces could capture him at any moment. Thankfully, the chaos provided some anonymity in the crowd. Though he wore a tabard over his breastplate which signified his house, there were many other lords and knights, each bearing their own coat of arms. As such, the man took advantage of the chaos and fled to the eastern gate, which, as far he knew, was still under his forces' control. However, the man did not get far. As he was sprinting in the direction of the gate, cavalry began to ride into the city. These knights and lancers on horseback belonged to Count Otto. Riding at the front of the group was the loyal count himself. They noticed a heavily armed man bearing Lothar's coat of arms running away. Though it could not be seen beneath his great bassinet's visor, Otto was grinning with excitement. He had finally found the traitor, and if he could be captured alive, the battle would end sooner. Thus Otto and his knights quickly rode down any resistance in the way and rapidly caught up to Lothar. Before the traitorous count could regroup with his forces at the eastern gate, he was surrounded by Otto and his heavily armored knights. Otto did not allow for a single gap for the traitor to escape and confirm the man's identity. He called out to him. "Running away, are you? In the face of defeat, you do not have the courage to face your own death in glorious battle. For a traitor, you are quite pathetic." Lothar was resigned to his fate. Steel-clad horses and knights surrounded him. There was no path to victory nor escape. He could merely sigh and face captivity. If Lady Luck were on his side, he would be able to escape from his predicament, though he feared this was not the case. As such, he did not respond to Otto's insults. Instead, he admitted his defeat. "I know when I am beaten. Well played, Otto. I did not expect you to overcome my defenses so quickly. You can rest assured knowing that I was never capable of penetrating the castle's defenses. As far as I am aware, the Duke's family is safe and sound." Beneath the visor of his great bassinet, Count Otto sneered in disgust at the man before him. A man he once considered his own hubris now brought down his rival as such. Otto expressed his contempt for Lothar. He ordered his arrest. You should have been content with your lot in life. Men, arrest this traitor. With his weapon no longer in his hands, and the heavily armored knights cautiously approaching Lothar, he quickly restrained the man and cuffed him into iron shackles. They then removed his helmet to stare at the man so bold as to revolt against his liege during a time of crisis. However, what revealed itself was a haggard man, driven to exhaustion by the war he started. Lothar was merely a shadow of his former self at this point, and his appearance showed it. Otto then brought him before the fighting armies and blew a horn which gathered everyone's attention. Lothar's forces quickly saw that their liege had been captured and knew they were defeated. There was no longer a purpose in fighting. Lothar's rebellion and the war in Tyrol were over. As such, Count Otto boldly declared for all the men to hear. I have captured your liege, surrender now, and hand over the other traitorous lords, and you will be allowed to return to your homes peacefully. The various noblemen who had followed Lothar into battle were frightened at this news and looked around anxiously. Through the open-face bassinets and the kettle helmets of the man-at-arms, they could see in their eyes the desire to betray their masters. As such, a skirmish quickly ensued, and Lothar's forces turned on their masters in an attempt to save their own hides. Very quickly, the ringleaders of Lothar's rebellion were either killed in the last stand against their own forces or brought forward to Count Otto, where the remainder of Lothar's forces surrendered their arms willingly. Count Otto fully intended to bring these captives to Duke Wilmar at Munich, where they would be punished accordingly by their rightful liege. He did not want to take the credit for ending the rebellion, because after all, it was his future son-in-law who had done the majority of the work. By rapidly conquering Tyrol, Berengar cut off any form of support or reinforcements in which Lothar might receive on his quest to become Duke of Austria. This was not Berengar's only noteworthy feat, for the young Viscount had also managed to send significant material aid to Otto's forces as he laid siege to Lothar's defenses. If not for this aid, he would not have been able to so swiftly retake the city, which was the Duke's seat of power. The impression of his future son-in-law grew exponentially in Otto's heart, and he had at this point practically forgiven Berengar's infidelity. As the siege of Vienna ended and the traitors captured, so too did the war in Austria. For now, Austria would find some semblance of peace in the upcoming months. With the entire German world at war and the conflict spreading to the rest of the empire, it would only be a matter of time before violence found its way back into the Duchy of Austria. When that happened, Berengar's position would be in a far better position to confront any army which entered the lands of Austria. Chapter 148 Heroes Welcome. Berengar's army, or what remained of it, had been marching since he successfully annexed the Prince-Bishopric of Trent into the county of Tyrol. It had been weeks at this point, and he could finally see the city of Kufstein and its impregnable defenses on the horizon. It had been over 2 months since he first began his campaign, and he had achieved an overwhelming victory against the rebellious forces. A warm smile appeared on the handsome youth's face as he gazed upon his homeland with delight, muttering the words on his mind beneath his breath as he sat atop his war steed, which had proven to be an excellent companion during the last 2 months of his life. We are finally home. Berengar's losses in the war were quite low. Less than 1,000 men on his side had perished in the conflict. As for the levies that were allied with him, their number was a bit higher. Still, he did not count them among his own casualties, as they were technically not his forces at the moment. As for the army behind his back, it was less than half of what he had invaded Trent with. The region was given command by Arnulf temporarily until a time in which the rebellion had officially ended. As for Eckhard, he was in charge of South Tyrol and its garrisons. The spirit of resistance was still within the hearts of many citizens who Berengar had conquered in this time, but at the moment, they did not act upon it. Once the war was officially over, Eckhard, Arnulf, and the forces left behind in the region would remain there until a more permanent garrison comprised of locals who had properly been indoctrinated into his army was established. It had been 2 months since he felt his lover's warm embrace, or since he saw the dazzling sapphire eyes of his baby boy, and Berengar had missed them greatly. As such, when he rode into the city, which was currently covered in snow, he had a large smile on his face. When Berengar and his forces entered the city of Kufstein, the citizens of the city lined up across the streets, welcoming the return of their liege as a conquering hero. Cheers echoed across the city as Berengar rode at the front of his army, dressed in his garishly decorated blackened steel plate armor. Berengar had thought to himself as he smiled and waved at his subjects. So this is a hero's welcome? It is truly fitting. To the citizens of Kufstein, Berengar had accomplished the unthinkable. He spread the glory of their territory and captured the entirety of the County Tyrol and its neighbor, the Prince Bisifric of Trent, from their enemies in a span of 2 months. Though many of his men had died in the conflict, Berengar would keep his promise and exempt their families from taxes for a duration of time. However, the people of Kufstein did not know about this promise yet. After riding through the streets of Kufstein, Berengar dismissed his armies. They could return home to their loved ones for the time being. After all, they had more than earned it. It was only after his army fully gathered into ranks and fully saluted Berengar at Kufstein Castle's steps that he understood the extent of their loyalty. Such a performance was not asked of them, yet they took it upon themselves to salute their lord and commander, who had to lead them against unthinkable odds and into an overwhelming victory. Berengar returned their salute before marching into the castle's gates. The moment Berengar stepped through the gates of his castle, he was practically mowed over by Lind, who rushed into his arms like a charging bull. Luckily for him, he was capable of standing his ground and accepted her embrace. Her family, as well as Henrietta, had gathered nearby and witnessed the loving reunion. Berengar began to greet Lind. "Did you miss?" Before he could even finish his sentence, Berengar's lover had pressed her lips against his own and parted them with her tongue in a passionate display of affection. Her siblings were quite shocked by her boldness and watched in embarrassment for some time as the two continued to fondle one another openly. It was only when Berengar reached for Linda's substantial breasts that someone decided to spoke up. Liutbert grunted to signal to the couple that they had company, and we were quickly getting out of hand. Realizing that her siblings were watching, Lind quickly retracted herself from Berengar's embrace and looked down with embarrassment. Her cheeks were completely flushed at this point, and she could not help but be ashamed of her actions. Berengar, on the other hand, smiled and licked his lips before greeting Lind and the others. "So I guess that's a yes?" Afterward, he quickly grabbed a hold of Linda's waist and dragged her over to the others. Linda's siblings each had a different expression on their faces. Adelheid considered Berengar to be a womanizer taking advantage of her big sister, but she knew he was capable of achieving great things and had helped topple her father's dastardly plans. As such, she was conflicted with how to treat the man in front of her. Liutbert had already chosen to submit to Berengar and gracefully welcomed the man that would become the next Count of Tyrol. He had already received news of Lothar's defeat at Vienna. After becoming aware of his father's defeat, Liutbert finally realized that he had made the right choice in supporting Berengar. As for Hermann, he was acting like a stubborn little brat, greatly scowling at the man who had rebelled against his father. The little misfit could not help but blame Berengar for the defeat and captivity of his father. Lind also had one other sibling, a little sister, roughly Henrietta's age, and this girl was named Minna, and she was rather welcoming to Berengar. Minna had grown close to Henrietta throughout the past month of captivity in Kufstein, and Henrietta had filled her ears with stories of Berengar and his gallant acts. Berengar did not even need to sway the little girl to his side, as she had already developed the image of Berengar being a knight in shining armor. From how Henrietta talked about his past, he seemed like some form of Prince Charming. As such, she was happy to finally see the man she admired, and his good looks did not disappoint. Henrietta, of course, was beaming with a smile on her face as her elder brother returned home alive. With her parents retiring to the countryside and Lambert exiled, Berengar was her only family left, and she greatly dreaded some misfortune that might befall him. In her hands was the baby Hans, which she spent a great deal of time looking after, considering in his absence Lind was forced to deal with the civil affairs of Kufstein. Seeing his infant son in Henrietta's hands, Berengar walked over to her and grabbed a hold of his child. "Hans, your father has returned." With that, Berengar held onto his child, surrounded by loved ones and allies. He felt completely safe for the first time in what appeared to him like a lifetime of war. As such, a grand feast was thrown that night to celebrate his return, and he had begun to invite his friends throughout Kufstein to partake in it. During the extravagant meal, which tasted like ambrosia straight from the mouth of God after having eaten nothing but bread and salted pork for 2 months, Berengar forced himself to stop stuffing his face and made a victory toast. Everyone expected him to say something valiant, something bold, or a declaration of future prospects. Instead, Berengar merely lifted his glass and said the somber words that had plagued his mind since the combat began. To our fallen warriors, may they forever rest in peace. The serious toast brought the excited audience out of their celebratory mood and forced them back to reality. Every victory was paved with the blood of the dead and those brave men who fought on the front lines. The fact that Berengar had used that as a toast undoubtedly killed the mood, but it also achieved the effect he was hoping for. It reminded everyone around him of the price of victory. Chapter 141 Lothar's Demise. Weeks passed, and while Berengar was acclimating to the peaceful environment of Kufstein after having been at war for so long, Count Lothar and his rebel supporters were being dragged to Munich, which had recently been captured by Duke Wilmar, where they waited for Count Otto's return before marching on Landshut. Inside a carriage designed to hold prisoners, Lothar sat in the corner, his back resting against the cold iron bars as he struggled for warmth. The ice-cold air of winter permeated between the gaps of the iron bars and sucked the heat from his body. Beside him were his vassals who had supported him in his rebellion, or at least the few who survived the disastrous siege of Vienna. Lothar's face had not changed since his capture. He had been scowling ever since, thinking over what he could have done to achieve victory. As he stared into space, he overheard the knights tasked with escorting his prison carriage mocking him. The mighty Count Lothar, look at him now. Defeated at Vienna, having his lands usurped by an upstart viscount, even his own son and heir denounced him and his actions. Pathetic. These words stirred Lothar from his stupor. He had not been aware of what happened outside of Vienna as he and his forces were trapped inside the city walls during the majority of Berengar's conquest of Tyrol. He quickly rose from his seat and climbed over to the area where the guards were talking, peering at them. However, the flat of a sword quickly smacked upon his hands as he grasped a hold of the iron bars, forcing him back into the cage. This action instantly provoked the laughter of the knights as they mocked the pitiful position the once mighty Count Lothar had fallen to. However, Lothar did not care about that. He needed to know what happened to his home. As such, he quickly asked the knights about the information. What you said, is it true? The knights nodded and grinned as they chastised Lothar for his failure. They were all too happy to provide him with the information about what happened to his home while he was trapped in Vienna. Some people are calling Berengar a war saint. The man led a small army of 5,000 men and conquered all of Tyrol and the nearby Prince-Bishopric of Trent in a little over 2 months. Innsbruck was the second place to fall to him. After capturing your family and dragging them back to Kufstein, your son Liebert denounced you and your treachery. He even pledged his loyalty to Berengar, going so far as to proclaim him a man worthy of your title. Your own family thinks of you as nothing more than a backstabbing scoundrel. Naturally, the rumors had inflated Berengar's victory, if not for the conscripts which added 5,000 men to his armies and the thousands of levies who fought beside him, he would not have so rapidly seized the territory. However, it was still quite the feat, one which was mostly achieved through superior firepower. Lothar was shocked by this news and struggled to come to terms with it. The incessant mocking which followed completely went unnoticed by the traitorous count. Instead, he sunk back into the corner of his cell and began to piece together what had led to his downfall. In a masterful move by Berengar, his own daughter turned against him, luring a quarter of his army to their certain deaths. Where Berengar then waged a lightning war in Tyrol, cutting off all support from arriving in Vienna, which was practically on the other side of the duchy. By being overeager and over-ambitious, Lothar had left himself completely shut off from his allies back in his own territory and left them to fend for themselves against a powerful foe. With no support and a large chunk of his forces missing, Otto was able to trap him and defeat his forces with ease. Count Lothar sighed heavily. He fully realized the faults he had made in this war. They stemmed from a combination of being a poor father, underestimating his enemies, and immediately going for the enemy capital without establishing a supply line. Only now he realized why Berengar had sold him such high-quality equipment for such a fair price. Because Berengar had already outfitted his own soldiers with some form of armor and weaponry far superior to what he was selling. Berengar had outmaneuvered him at every turn. The worst part of it all was that Count Lothar was not even mad. What he felt was overwhelming respect for how Berengar had played him since the beginning. After reflecting on his life choices in silence for some time, the carriage finally pulled into the city square of Munich, where a platform was constructed in the middle of the area. Soldiers and civilians alike had gathered to witness the event, and upon seeing the platform, Lothar instantly realized what awaited him. He and his allies would be beheaded publicly for all to witness. The moment the carriage stopped, the other lords within the cell began to panic and struggle, yet they were all pulled out one at a time by the knights and brought up to the platform. Though they were not able to see the results, everyone knew what was happening, and as such, they did everything they could to escape. All except for Lothar, who sat in his corner with cold, dead eyes. He had already accepted what was to come. Over an hour passed, and finally, he was all that remained within the carriage. When the guards came to escort him, he did not even resist in the slightest. He wobbled onto the platform with a defeated expression and gazed upon the crowd who jeered him and threw produce and cow pies at him. By the time he reached the chopping block, he was already covered in filth, not that he was in pristine condition before. Standing in the crowd was Duke Wilmar, who was fully armored and surrounded by his houseguard. A chilling smile was on his face as he stared into Count Lothar's lifeless eyes as the man was placed headfirst onto the chopping block. Finally, Count Otto began reading his charges, who announced his crimes to the realm and his sentence. Count Lothar, for the crimes of rebelling against your liege and laying siege to his lands in an attempt to usurp his position, you are hereby found guilty and sentenced to death. You and your family's lands and titles are hereby forfeit, where they shall be henceforth be granted to Viscount Berengar von Kufstein and his family for perpetuity. May God have mercy on your soul. Hearing that last part, a bitter smile formed on Lothar's face as he stared into Duke Wilmar's eyes. In the end, Lothar had lost everything, and the young Viscount, who started as a baron's son, who Lothar once believed to be a sickly fool, had inherited his position. It was truly a fitting end. The last thing Lothar saw as the executioner's blade came swinging down upon his neck was the sight of a violent crowd cursing him to damnation and the shocked expression on Wilmar's face when he realized that Lothar was smiling. Afterward, everything faded black for Count Lothar, and his head was separated from his shoulders. His blood pooled out from the gaping hole in his neck where his head once belonged. The rebellion was over, Berengar had won, and was now officially declared a count. Lothar would forever be remembered as a stepping stone on Berengar's rise to power. Chapter 142 Consolidation of Power. News quickly spread of Count Lothar's execution and the forfeiture of his lands in favor of Berengar and his dynasty. In the year since Berengar had been reincarnated into this world, he had gone from a lowly baron's son to the Count of Tyrol. The young man was quite satisfied with his accomplishments, and despite his grand ambitions to unify the German-speaking regions, he knew these plans could not be rushed. As such, while the rest of Germany was at war, Berengar was tasked by Duke Wilmar to protect Tyrol from potential enemy advances through the Bavarian Alps, which he was more than happy to do. Now was the time for expansion, not just in military matters but industrial, agricultural, and educational sectors as well. Thus Berengar was hard at work putting through a series of executive orders, which allowed him to bypass the rudimentary parliament he had constructed. As per usual, the parliamentary system was more symbolic than it was practical. Their practical purpose was to decrease the workload on Berengar's shoulders, while symbolically, they represented the people's interests. The first matter of business was to change the capital of Tyrol to Kufstein. With a stroke of a quill, the city that had been the political and economic center of the region for centuries had been shifted to Berengar's homeland. As for industrial expansion, it was time to create a second industrial city. Innsbruck was perfect for the role. It was nearby and maintained by a loyal member of what he considered to be his family. After all, Liutbert was his lover's brother. Thus he was practically an in-law. Berengar had made Liutbert the Viscount of Innsbruck and his chancellor, at least until a time where he could expand his power and make the man a proper count like he was born to be. As such, he tasked the man with leading the charge to reform Innsbruck's defenses, industry, and agriculture. As for military concerns, Berengar had begun to spread his military reforms across the entire region. Due to the number of men who had died in the civil war, there were not many men at arms left to oppose him, and those that remained would not have the guts to do so. Though the lords of Tyrol were greatly outraged by the military reforms which stripped their feudal powers to raise their own forces, there was not much they could do as their armies were exhausted, and they knew the power Berengar had in his hands. As such, young men of military age began being conscripted across the region and sent to Berniger's training facilities to be indoctrinated into his military, they would undergo political indoctrination as a part of their training. It was a system designed to break down the old identity of the feudal regions among his forces, enforce the idea of a German nation, and ensure loyalty to Berengar and his dynasty. Once the lords had time to lick their wounds, they would undoubtedly prepare for rebellion. After all, the stripping of certain parts of their feudal powers was not a popular reform, even among the nobility of his own region. Though the local nobles of Kufstein had come to accept these reforms, the rest of the Tyrolean noblemen would not be so easily persuaded. Not only did Berengar have to prepare to put down a future rebellion, but he also had to prepare for the Teutonic invasion that is currently marching towards his borders. Speaking of which, Lind had a report in her hands, which she placed on Berengar's desk. With Berengar's return, she had resumed her position as his spymaster, but in reality, she spent most of her time looking after their child. However, at the moment, the child was with Henrietta while she informed Berengar of the latest news regarding the Teutonic army marching on their borders. They have doubled their numbers through their marches. The moment they entered German territories, they began forcefully conscripted levies from the regions they passed by. Considering the majority of the Holy Roman Empire was in chaos at the moment, nobody has been able to stop them from doing so. Though the levies are not well equipped, they can be used as cannon fodder to overrun our numbers. At the rate we are currently going, we will be able to field a small division of between 10,000 to 15,000 men when they reach our borders. However, that will be less than half of the Teutonic army's numbers by the time they enter Tyrol. Unless we resort to drafting men from the garrisons, it will be a tough battle. Berengar contemplated Linda's words carefully. The Teutonic army started with 10,000 men. Still, now they were at roughly 20,000 men with several more months of marching before they reached Tyrol. At the rate of their expansion, they will easily have 30,000 men by the time they arrived at his borders. However, if he transferred men from the garrisons he stationed across Tyrol, he would be inviting the lords of Tyrol to take advantage of the crisis against him and start a rebellion, forcing him into a two-war front. He could never allow this to happen. There were two options on Berengar's hands: lure the enemy into Kufstein, where he could use the near impenetrable city walls to his advantage, or confront them in a field battle while being heavily outnumbered. Such a battle would be massive and would undoubtedly result in melee combat. Berengar's greatest advantage would be to field rifled muskets in large numbers and wear down the enemy forces at a distance with gunfire and artillery shells before they finally clashed. As such, he came to a decision and announced his plan to Lind. If we withdraw forces from our garrisons to increase our field army, the result would be an unmitigated disaster. Therefore I will confront the Teutonic army in the field with as many men as we can muster. Though Lind feared this would be the option Berengar would take, deep down, she knew he would never hide behind Kufstein's walls while the Teutonic order ravaged his land. She merely sighed as she listened to Berengar as he explained his plans. I will increase the conversion and production of 1,417 18th rifled muskets and will seek to draw the enemy forces to an area whose terrain gives me an advantage. With this, we have a much higher chance of defeating the enemy. Inform the spies to continue monitoring the Teutonic forces. I want to know about any potential growth as quickly as possible. Lind nodded her head in response and smiled. Of course, Master, anything for you. With that said, Lind was dismissed, and Berengar returned to the pile of work on his hands. After returning to a mountain of paperwork, he greatly missed the days of battle where he was free to act as he pleased. Nevertheless, Account's work was never finished, and Tyrol greatly needed agricultural, industrial, and economic reforms. As such, he quickly got back to signing executive orders that would one day transform Tyrol into the seat of power of the future German Empire. Chapter 143. It is only natural for siblings to share. In Graz, Adela currently sat at her desk reading a letter in her hands which Berengar wrote. As usual, it expressed his desire to meet up with his young fiancée, and of course, he boasted about his achievements in battle. The fact that Berengar had become a count greatly pleased the teenage youth. It meant that she would become a countess, much like her mother once she married Berengar. Though she knew Berengar was destined for great things, she had no idea that she would be empress of a unified German empire one day. As such, she was content with Berengar's gains and knew he was most likely dreadfully busy consolidating his power. Adela was not aware that the Teutonic order was marching on Tyrol and had no worries about Berengar's immediate future. He was home, and he was safe, and that was all that mattered to the young girl. She had greatly desired to visit Kufstein, but in a time such as this that was filled with chaos and uncertainty, the roads to her fiancé's home would not be safe. Thus, despite her protests, she was locked away in the castle of Graz under her family's orders. As far as she was aware, her father, Count Otto, had marched with Duke Wilmar's forces onto Landshut after capturing Munich, which was the seat of the Duke of Bavaria's power. The war in Bavaria had entered a new stage of intensity as the Duke of Bavaria was outraged by the fact that his home had been seized. Luckily for him, his family had fled the city before it was fully captured and were staying with a loyal lord in a safer region of his territory. However, despite this, the Duke of Bavaria marched half of his forces from the north back into Bavaria to halt the advance of the Austrian host which had invaded his lands. To Adela, the war was inconsequential as, aside from some fighting in Tyrol and Vienna, it had not yet spread to the borders of Austria. Even if it had, Berengar's mighty army was essentially the home defenders while the Duke was off fighting with his main army in Bavaria. If Graz were to ever come under siege, Berengar would surely come to her rescue. After thinking about her situation, Adela wrote a letter back to Berengar congratulating him on his gains and impressive victory. She also expressed her desire to see him again but explained her current circumstances that prevented such a reunion. By the time she had finished writing it, the message was nothing more than a love letter that resembled that which was written by a young girl to her crush. However, shortly after finishing writing her love letter to her fiancé, Adela heard a knock on her door, which startled her, spilling her ink container all over the letter and thoroughly ruining it. She was greatly displeased by this event but had no way of controlling it. As such, she rapidly cleaned up the mess before storming over to the door with a pouting expression on her face. After opening the door, Adela noticed her eldest sister standing in the doorway. She was roughly the age of Berengar and had long since been married to the son of another count within Austria. In fact, the young woman known as Eva von Salzburg had not been to her family's home in quite some time and was quite excited to see her youngest sister and how much she had grown. After all, she lived with her husband and 3 children in Salzburg, Austria, where she was married to the count's eldest son. Seeing how much Adela had grown over the years, the beautiful and busty woman that was Adela's older sister quickly grabbed a hold over the little girl and squeezed her tightly with a wide grin on her face. "Little Adela, you have grown so much." Adela struggled to get out of her eldest sister's grasp, but unfortunately, she could not break free from the tight grip that encompassed her and nearly suffocated as her tiny heart-shaped face was stuffed into Eva's massive cleavage. It was only after Adela ended her resistance to the hug that the tall and curvy woman finally released her grasp. Afterward, Adela backed away from her overly affectionate big sister and pouted, which quickly led to Eva noticing that something was going on in the background. She quickly deduced that there was an ink-stained sheet of paper, and when Eva noticed the look on Adela's face, she quickly smiled sinisterly and began to tease her little sister. "Adela, were you perhaps writing a love letter? I heard that you have gotten yourself quite the capable fiancé." Adela's cute face quickly flushed with embarrassment as she immediately denied the allegations in the most obvious attempt to cover up her actions. "Of course not. Why would I write such a thing?" Seeing her little sister acting so sheepishly, Eva licked her lips like a wolf gazing at its prey and advanced closer to Adela before whispering in her ear. "I heard he is really handsome. Do you mind if I have a taste?" Eva was not genuinely interested in Berengar as she was happily married. Her husband was decent-looking enough and came from a high noble family, whereas Berengar was merely an upstart. Despite this, Eva could not resist the urge to tease Adela and make her angry. Adela, of course, instantly fell into Eva's trap and behaved exactly as the sly woman had expected. She pushed Eva away and began yelling at her while throwing a little tantrum. "Absolutely not. You are disgusting. Why would you even suggest something like that?" Seeing that Adela had reacted so adorably to her joke, Eva went in for the kill. She just loved the cute expression on Adela's face when she was angry. "Why not? We are siblings. After all, it is only natural for us to share. After all, I heard that fiancé of yours already has a mistress, so clearly, you are not against the idea of sharing your man." This touched on Adela's reverse scale. She was fine sharing Berengar with Lind since the 2 young women had come to some degree of an arrangement, but she absolutely would never allow her big sister to lay claim to her man. Of course, if Adela knew that Eva was teasing her and in reality, looked down on her for marrying a man from a family of such low nobility, She would only be more infuriated as such. Her response to Ava's provocation was far more civil than it could have been. "Get out of my room, Ava. I have no interest in having this conversation with you and your filthy mind." Thus Adela struggled to push her eldest sister out of her room, which continued to tease Adela on her way out. "Oh, come on, you are being unfair, just one bite." And with that last remark, Ava was forced out of her room, and the door was slammed behind her. While Adela was fuming inside her quarters, sitting with her back to the door and her face resting on her knees, Ava was smiling in excitement on the opposite side of the thick wooden door. After all, her little sister was just too cute when provoked in such a manner. Chapter 144: Construction of Monuments. With a relatively stable peace encapsulating the mountainous region of Tyrol following Berengar's conquest, the young count took the time to establish the construction of several monuments since his return. Each monument was crafted for different aspects of propaganda. The first of these monuments to be constructed was intended to represent the personal glory and authority of Berengar von Kufstein. The monument was constructed on a similar scale and design to that of the Hermannsdenkmal statue from Germany in Berengar's previous life. The monument was placed on a hill above the city of Kufstein, which overlooked its region as an eternal guardian. The large statue was meticulously crafted out of bronze to represent Berengar's figure perfectly. The statue itself was designed with Berengar mounted upon his trusty steed Erwin, though the horse itself lacked his barding, and Berengar was dressed in his exquisite three-quarters plate armor. With a pair of cavalry boots that went up to the knees of his Landsknecht-like attire, the statue was designed without Berengar's Waffenrock, his iron skullcap, and feathered cap. In one hand, Berengar held his 1417 heavy cavalry saber and pointed it in the direction of the city of Rome. The position of the statue, and especially that of its sword, was a twofold statement. First and foremost, brandishing his sword towards Rome represented the ancient Germanic people's struggle against the Roman Empire. The second meaning behind it was a sign of resistance towards the papacy and its corruption, as well as a provocation towards Berengar's personal enemy, being Pope Simeon II. Nearly a month had passed since Berengar returned from Tyrol, and during that time, the construction of this grand monument was finished. When it was finally complete, Berengar stood before the symbol and smiled. It was truly a magnificent piece of art and showed that the level of craftsmanship of his people was beginning to advance to the era of the Renaissance. After all, Berengar had inspired his people to take up the arts. However, he himself could never teach art as he was woefully inept at the subject. He could at least create a society that allowed artisans and craftsmen to explore the depths of their talent. The fact that the statue was so grand proved that he had made the right decision to spend a small portion of the treasury to subsidize artists and craftsmen with great potential. Standing next to Berengar gazing upon the magnificent display was Lind, who was holding her child in her hands. She gazed between the immaculate facial features of her lover and that of his statue and praised the work. "It looks exactly like you." Berengar's grin could not get any wider. For so long this medieval world was devoid of any form of advanced art. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire, the art of the European world had suffered greatly, regressing to a laughable point, and yet for the first time in centuries a grand creation had taken place in Europe that was on par with the major works of classical antiquity. He could not contain the excitement he had for the other monuments being constructed. If his personal statue turned out this well, then the others should be even more grandiose. After staring at his own statue, Berengar finally responded to Linda's claim with a nod. "It is marvelous. I did not expect it to turn out so well. Truly the talent I have fostered over the past few months has been worth it." Berengar was not exaggerating about taking some degree of credit for the project. After all, it was his vision that had come into reality, and without his economic support, the artists of his territory would not be able to afford to improve their skills full-time. Though Berengar lacked the ability to create art itself, his mind was filled with creative ideas that could be expanded upon and turned into masterpieces when explained to a proper artisan. Berengar would never take full credit for the masterpiece. In his eyes, he supplied a basic outline of the project, and the funding needed to achieve it, which he believed to be a minimal contribution. The credit of such a magnificent monument and the glory that came with it was left entirely in the hands of the artisans and craftsmen who brought it into this world. The lead designer of the statue walked over to Berengar and noticed the Count's wide grin. As such, he was greatly pleased to see that Berengar enjoyed the piece. However, he still felt like asking if it turned out as Berengar had wished. As such, he voiced his thoughts. "I hope it is to your liking, Your Excellency." Berengar immediately snapped back to reality after being entranced by the monument, went up to the project lead, and happily shook his hand. "Gerlach, you and your team have really outdone yourselves. It is truly inspiring. This monument will stand as a testament to the power of our people for centuries to come." Though the man named Gerlach knew that the statue was more related to Berengar's personal prestige and the authority of his dynasty, it was still great to hear such praise. In truth, this was not the only project Gerlach was working on. He was also overseeing the construction of the monument dedicated to those who had fallen in Schwaz, which was being constructed on the site of the ambush in which Berengar and his forces had suffered on that cold winter's night. As such, the man discussed the progress with the other monument with which he was tasked. "I am glad to hear that Your Excellency is pleased. I want to inform you that the monument to the fallen soldiers at Schwaz is fully under construction and will be finished in a few months." Due to the much larger scale of the monument in Schwaz, Berengar was pleased with the timeframe. However, he did not have the time to enjoy the statue any longer. He was needed back in Kufstein. As such, the young count addressed the artisan before departing. "Excellent, keep up the good work. I expect great things from you. However, I am needed elsewhere, so I am afraid we must save the rest of this conversation for another time. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors." With that said, Berengar and Lind left the monument and enjoyed their stroll back to the castle in Kufstein. He had a lot of work to do when he returned, and as such, he enjoyed the brief time he had with his lover before he threw himself back into an endless pile of paperwork. The Teutonic Order was rapidly advancing onto Kufstein, and it would be within the borders of Tyrol shortly. At this point, Berengar had at most 2 months before they arrived, and preparations needed to be made. As such, Berengar would be extremely busy in the coming months. Chapter 145 God Wills It. An army bearing the legendary white field with the black cross upon it marched through the town of Suhl. The Teutonic Order was close to the region of Bavaria. After making their stop in Suhl, and resupplying, the army would advance forwards through the Bavarian Alps and into Tyrol, where they would raze Berengar's lands to the ground. Or at least that was the plan. Currently, the Teutonic Order was conscripting as many men from the town as possible into their army. Young or old, as long as they were capable of bearing arms, they were stripped from the towns the Teutonic army visited and placed into their ranks as levies. In the middle of the town, a scene displayed itself as a 13-year-old boy was dragged away from his mother's arms and lined up into the ranks of the new levies. The mother begged with tears to knights who had snatched her child, yet for all her effort, the woman was only rewarded with a swift kick to the stomach, dropping her to her knees as she bawled in misery. Across this town and every village, the Teutonic Order had come across similar scenes such as this had become the norm. The ruthlessness of the Teutonic army under Lambert's command knew no bounds, and they were even willing to slaughter the families of those who refused to join the service of their great crusade. Though this village was different than the others in which they previously passed. As the cruelty of the Teutonic Order was displayed for the villagers to see, some of them began to gather. The townsfolk quickly formed a mob that began to berate the Teutonic soldiers who had forcefully taken their sons and fathers away from them. What started as a peaceful protest quickly resulted in a full-scale riot. The townsfolk began to push and shove the soldiers of the Teutonic Order and throw produce and filth in their directions. Things were beginning to spiral out of control when Lambert arrived on horseback. Seeing the lowly peasants dare to defy his orders, Lambert got off of his horse and took off his great bassinet, revealing his charming face for all to see. The solution to this problem was simple. He would preach how it was the will of God for the men of this village to embark on a holy crusade to put down the heretics in Tyrol. Berengar's reformation had already begun to spread rapidly. Words of Berengar's rapid conquest of Tyrol had spread quickly and had been taken as a sign of divine retribution against the traitor Lothar. However, Lambert was more concerned with bringing down his brother and ending his rise to power than he was with fulfilling the duties of his task to end the Berengar heresy in its entirety. As such, he took a diplomatic approach and approached the angry mob, attempting to placate them with a sermon. "Citizens of Suhl, I understand your complaints, but our order is on a mission from the Pope himself. We require the assistance of every man and youth capable of bearing arms to bring down the wretched Berengar heresy which has begun to fester in these lands. Only by cutting off the head of the serpent known as Berengar the Accursed can the will of God be restored to these lands. Lambert did not know that many of the townsfolk were what would later become known as German reformists, and they held Berengar in high regard. As such, a courageous young man who appeared to be a wealthy merchant or the son of one stood before the crowd and began to defend Berengar in front of the Teutonic Order, who had been tasked with his elimination. "Who are you to declare Berengar a heretic? I have read the Bible, which he has translated into our language, and given the ability for all men, regardless of their birth, the ability to comprehend the word of God. Not a single one of his views and that of the priest Ludolf goes against the teachings of Christ as is written in the scripture. If anything, it is the Pope who is the heretic, as many of the claims of the Catholic Church are not written in the word of the apostles or Christ himself. Berengar is a pious and enlightened man who acts against the corruption of the ecclesiarchy, and for that, you all wish to silence him. Have you no guilt?" As the man spoke, the entirety of the mob began to agree with him and further chastised the Teutonic Order for their actions. If anything, they were even more outraged now that they knew the intentions of this army and were unwilling to stand by and do nothing when such a large army was tasked with hunting down the head of their reformation. Quickly things got out of hand, and Lambert was not handling it well. Hearing the villagers take Berengar's side enraged him to his very core. How could Berengar's influence reach so far that these filthy peasants were willing to defy the authority of the Teutonic Order and, by extension, the papacy? This was outrageous. As Lambert was fuming with anger, a small child threw a cow pie in his face and shouted at him, "Go away, you evil men!" With this action, something snapped in Lambert's mind, and he instinctively gripped the hilt of his sword where he quickly unsheathed the blade sword in a smooth chopping motion. He cut off the head of the child who was no older than 8. The head of the child slowly rolled on the floor as blood sprayed onto Lambert's white tabard. A loud shriek filled the air, which belonged to the child's mother, who just witnessed her own son get decapitated before her eyes. Horrified and enraged by Lambert's actions, the mob quickly clashed with the soldiers of the Teutonic Order. They were no longer thinking rationally and had decided in the heat of the moment to enact justice on these heavily armed and well-trained soldiers. Seeing that the mob had taken up arms against him, Lambert sneered in disdain and gave the order above the crowd's shouts to the men under his command. "This village is filled with heretics, kill them all and burn the town to ashes. God wills it." Despite witnessing their commanding officer murder a child in cold blood, not a single one of the fanatic soldiers of the Teutonic Order cared, for, in their minds, the little boy was a heretic and deserved his fate. Instead, they all raised their weapons and began to massacre the townsfolk. Their victims could see the fierce zealotry contained within their eyes as the crusaders screamed their war chant over and over again. God wills it. With that, the entire population of Seoul was massacred, their town was burned to the ground, and the perpetrators confiscated their grain and livestock. By morning there would not be a single soul left alive within the confines of the once proud town. Only blood and ash would remain. Chapter 146 Grand Ambitions. The snow on the ground began to melt as spring had begun to arrive. Throughout Berengar's winter campaign, he had dealt with many difficulties, but as the breath of life filled the air around him, he felt as if he was embarking upon a new world. In front of him was a small village within the borders of the Viscounty of Kufstein. It was one of the many small villages throughout his homeland. Around this village, which housed a few hundred people, were the steel-reinforced concrete brick walls in the formation of a star fortress similar to those surrounding Kufstein. Throughout his war for Tyrol, Lind did not disappoint Berengar. As the person responsible for maintaining Berengar's plans while he was away, she had overseen the construction of star fortresses around the Viscounty of Kufstein, and after many months nearly all of them were complete. The value of these mighty bastions and the cannons mounted upon them could not be underestimated. After all, they had played a critical role in the defense of Kufstein against Lothar's forces. Beside Berengar was one of the men in charge of these construction efforts, and he gazed at the structure with a proud gleam in his eyes. As such, he could not prevent himself from commenting on the powerful defenses of such a small and seemingly insignificant agricultural village. Magnificent, is it not? Berengar nodded with approval as he took in the sight of the structure. While the village itself was protected by the mighty Start Fortress, which a company of soldiers garrisoned, the agricultural fields were outside the walls, creating a beautiful scene of planted fields and fortification. Berengar's ambitions did not end with Kufstein. He intended to construct these mighty fortresses around every major inhabited region within Tyrol, forming the mountainous county into the heartland of his future German Empire. The expense would be great, but with the increase in territory he had gained and the plethora of natural resources, he could afford to build it. Berengar rode into the town on horseback surrounded by a group of cuirassiers who acted as his personal guard for the moment. It was a small agricultural town, yet its walls made it seem like an important fortress. The locals peacefully coexisted with the garrison tasked with defending them, oftentimes offering them food and water as they stood guard among the ramparts of the mighty concrete walls. When the local villagers noticed that the man riding through their village was the Count of Tyrol himself, they instantly cleared a path for him out of respect. Many young women began to gossip among themselves as they were able to witness the majestic appearance of the infamous Berengar firsthand. Among the population of the Viscounty of Kufstein, Berengar had become quite the legend. His rise to power and defiance of the corruption of the church had begun being spread by wandering minstrels. Though these bardic epics greatly exaggerated his achievements, they quickly captured the imagination of the common populace, acting as a source of inspiration in their daily lives. However, despite the good light in which he was depicted in these songs, few were bold enough to approach Berengar as he was a man of great importance and power, and to offend him would surely mean one's demise, or so they believed. Berengar noticed this trend, and for the first time, began to realize that a sense of respect for his character had been fostered among his people. Still, it existed alongside an intense feeling of fear towards his power and prestige. The two emotions coexisted perfectly to create a harmonious balance within the minds of his citizens. To be both feared and respected was a balance few had ever achieved in life, and yet that was what Berengar had begun to cultivate in the wake of his overwhelming victories. After reaching the town center, Berengar dismounted from his horse and looked around at the environment. Despite having a garrison of 120 infantry and an artillery battery, the walls were designed so that such a small force could easily defend the village long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Though it may take years, or possibly even decades to achieve, one day Tyrol would be filled with such fortifications, making it virtually impossible for the armies of this world to dethrone Berengar in his seat of power. Berengar knew that the more territory he conquered, the more he would have to spend time and effort introducing his reforms. In his lifetime, he would be lucky to industrialize the entirety of his future empire. In fact, the likelihood was that he would leave behind a legacy of industrialization for his successors to accomplish. Nevertheless, Berengar would make sure that in this life, he would unite the German-speaking regions into a single empire and conquer enough colonies overseas to secure German hegemony for centuries to come. As Berengar gazed upon this beautiful agricultural town, which was just one of many throughout Tyrol, it may not have seemed like it would play a key component in his plans, but the fortifications that surrounded this village and one day the majority of Tyrol would give him the internal stability needed to focus his efforts on conquest for years to come. After looking at the degree of security that allowed the people of this town to live in a happy and carefree environment, despite a massive war going on, Berengar realized that the expense of expanding this project to encompass all of the inhabited regions of Tyrol was well worth it. Without such a powerful defense network, these villagers who went about their daily tasks with a friendly smile might be subjected to the horrors of war. A reality in which Berengar thought was far too cruel for the good people of his realm. As such, Berengar looked over at the architect who had led the construction project for this town, and instructed him to do the inconceivable. I want more villages like this, as many as you and the other architects can build. I want Tyrol to become a symbol of my power. I do not care the degree of funding and manpower you will need to accomplish this, just make sure that you do not cut any corners in the process. The architect looked at Berengar as if he was a madman. The expense to build a star fortress like this was no minor sum. To build these across all of Tyrol would easily cost a fortune. Nevertheless, Berengar was adamant, and despite the expense, he knew he could pay for it. This war across Germany was bound to last for years, and where there is war, there is profit to be made. With the new industrial sector of Innsbruck nearing completion, Berengar would have double the industrial power and could supply all the factions of this war with arms and armor necessary to maintain their armies. After seeing the daring expression in Berengar's eyes that appeared as if he was challenging the heavens with his ambitions, the architect gulped the saliva which had accumulated in his mouth and bowed his head respectfully to the young count. "Your Excellency, I will do as you command." With this, Berengar's plans to transform the entirety of the county of Tyrol into an impenetrable mountainous enclave had begun. Though it would take years, possibly even decades to complete, by the end of this ambitious initiative, one day in the distant future, the people of Tyrol would live in the most secure region of the world. Chapter 147 Contact with the Byzantines. A man with short dark hair in the form of a Caesar cut and emerald green eyes sat within the confines of his luxurious carriage. He was in his late 20s and quite handsome, so much so that he could give Berengar a run for his money. He had the regal features of a Roman patrician, and he wore lavish silk robes in the style that was common among the upper echelon of the aristocracy of the Byzantine Empire. Even though the German realm was currently in a state of total war, he had traveled across Europe for many months in an attempt to gain an audience with the man known as Berengar von Kufstein. Berengar had long since made use of the trade networks throughout Europe and the Mediterranean to acquire silk from the Byzantine Empire to fulfill the demands for his textile industry. However, his name did not carry much weight in the Eastern world. After all, even now as a count, he was not a significant figure in the world's affairs. His most well-known quality was being declared as a heretic by the Catholic Church. Though the Orthodox Church was a separate branch of Christianity from the Catholics, they were still quite amicable with their Western brothers in this timeline. As such, being declared a heretic by the Catholic Church practically carried over to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yet, the man in the carriage did not care about such details. Instead, he had a business proposal for Berengar in which he believed the young count could not refuse. The man arriving in Kufstein shortly was a powerful nobleman who held the equivalent position of a duke in the Byzantine aristocracy. Supposedly, Arethusa Maniakis could trace his lineage to one of the greatest Roman emperors of all time, Aurelian. A man who was so profound, he quite possibly could have prevented the collapse of the Roman Empire if the treacherous Praetorian Guard had not assassinated him before his work was finished. Arethusa was in his own right an exemplary statesman and general, having personally led the charge into Egypt in years prior. He secured a foothold in the war against the Mamluk Sultanate, which currently held control over the region. However, despite his impressive victories that had allowed the Byzantines to acquire their advantage in Egypt, he could not believe the rumors he had heard about Berengar. If Berengar knew a powerful strategos of the Byzantine Empire was coming to meet him, he would have prepared a feast. After all, such a position was far higher than he currently held. Yet, the man decided to show up unannounced to test Berengar and his character. A nobleman from another region coming into your territory unannounced was a sign of disrespect, and this was not unknown to Arethusa. However, when the man laid his eyes on the intricate defenses of the city of Kufstein, he could not help but be impressed. Such mighty walls were comparable to the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. No, they might even be superior in defensive capabilities. After arriving at the checkpoint of the city's gates, Arethusa noticed that the garrison was all wearing a degree of plate armor and carrying strange weapons slung across their backs. Though he did not know how these weapons functioned and were less impressed with them, his attention was drawn to the impressive armor the troops wore. Just how wealthy was Berengar to equip all of his troops in plate armor? Even if it only covered their torso, back, neck, thighs, and head. It was enough to protect the vital points of their bodies without limiting mobility. The garrison allowed him to pass after hearing the man was a powerful representative from the Byzantine Empire. As such, his carriage and escort quickly rode into the city of Kufstein, which was filled with tenements, homes, shops, and all kinds of wonders. It was no longer a small agricultural town but a full-fledged city, though much of it was still undergoing construction. Despite being attracted by the nature of the city, which was much smaller than Constantinople, yet still was grand in its own right, the strategos made his way towards the castle, where the castle's guards abruptly stopped him. Arethusa stepped out of the carriage and explained his reasoning for visiting. He spoke in German with a thick Greek accent, which did not go unnoticed by the sentries. I am strategos Arethusa Maniakis from the Byzantine Empire. I have come to discuss a business transition with the Count of this region. Confused with the man's identity, the guards did not react at first. However, the man seemed to be dressed in luxurious clothing and possibly have a high standing in the Byzantine Empire. As such, they decided to let him pass, but only after confiscating the weapons from him and his guard. Berengar had become quite cautious ever since he took a hold of Tyrol. he would not allow armed visitors in his presence in fear that they might try to assassinate him. After all, his reforms were becoming quite unpopular among the nobility within Tyrol. Arethusa quickly agreed to these demands and had his guards disarm themselves before entering the castle's gates. When Arethusa entered the castle, he was not overly impressed. After all, his palace was far more luxurious. Of course, he did not know that the castle was only temporary living for Berengar at this point, while his grand palace, which was loosely based on the Schönbrunn Palace from his previous life, was being constructed. After entering the Great Hall, Arethusa witnessed Berengar sitting upon his seat of power, with his head resting on his fist. The young count was currently dressed in luxurious velvet attire in his house's black and gold color scheme. The clothing was, of course, based on Tudor fashion, and he even had a fur-lined sleeveless cloak over his exquisite doublet. A pair of jewels hung from his neck where were made of gold and black garnet. While sitting upon his seat of power, Berengar exuded a sense of natural authority, so much so that even Arethusa, who held a far more prestigious position, could tell that Berengar was not a man to be trifled with. Before Arethusa could introduce himself to the fearsome count, Berengar noticed the man's approach into his great hall and gazed upon the man with a stoic expression while expressing his thoughts. "Who are you, and why should I care?" Berengar was quite perturbed that his rest had been interrupted by an unknown man from the east. Berengar had been hard at work all day long, and his seat of power was one of the few places he could just sit back and allow his mind a proper recovery. Despite his minor irritation, he could immediately tell by the fashion in which the man wore that he was someone of great importance, yet he had arrived within Berengar's territory, in his home, without announcing himself. The level of disrespect shown could not be understated. Seeing how Berengar reacted, Arethusa was quite shocked. The young count gazed upon him as if he was nothing of worth, and this was quite entertaining to the mighty strategos. As such, he boldly proclaimed his position within his own society and his intention for arriving. "I am Strategos Arethusa Maniakos. I have traveled far from the borders of the Byzantine Emperor to seek an audience with your excellency. I have a business proposal that you may be interested in." Despite the rudeness in which the man had shown, Berengar was quite interested in two things. The man was essentially a duke within the mighty Byzantine Empire, and he had a business proposal for him. However, despite his interest, Berengar decided to return this man's kindness with an equally rude gesture. "I am intrigued. However, I am currently busy and will need some time to prepare. Come back in 3 days." Ultimately, Berengar decided to snub the man. For the time being, the level of disrespect he was shown had to be paid in kind before he could move forward. It was petty, but if he accepted this disrespect, it meant that any nobleman of higher birth could walk over him. As such, he decided to show his authority and sent the man back to the city below. In the meantime, Berengar had intended to verify this man's identity by inquiring about the so-called Strategos Arethusa Maniakos through his trade connections. Though Arethusa wanted to protest, the glaring sapphire eyes which belonged to the young count sent shivers down his spine. After all, he was disarmed and standing in his great hall, which was surrounded by a group of armed men. As such, Arethusa played it safe and decided to return to the city and rest for a few days before returning. On his way out of the castle, a wide grin appeared across the man's face as he expressed his thoughts aloud. Well played. Chapter 148, Entertaining the Byzantine's Eye. Throughout the next couple of days, Arethusa spent his time going throughout the city of Kufstein and learning about its rapid progress. To think that less than a year ago, Kufstein could at most be considered an agricultural town. Though many regions of the city were still undergoing construction, the fact that the walls had been constructed and decent housing was provided for the area's citizens was astonishing to a man like Arethusa. The city's overall layout was constructed in a way that not only took security status in mind but also made certain districts in place that allowed for organized living. By far, the industrial district was the largest of these districts, and yet the trade district was a close second. The greatest part of Kufstein's design is that the walls extended far beyond the currently inhabited regions of the city, allowing for the potential of tens of thousands of more inhabitants to dwell within the city in the future. Of course, another series of walls could always be constructed if the city grew beyond its current limits. Though the industrial district was largely closed off to visitors, seeing such a vast quantity of smoke in the air led Arethusa to believe that there was most definitely a massive industrial output created in this city. Though, of course, he would not believe the amount of steel produced every month in Kufstein if he were to hear the exact amount. Arethes had initially come to Kufstein to secure an exclusive trade agreement with silk. After all, his personal territory grew vast quantities of the material, and he knew Berengar was expending a great sum to acquire it. However, seeing how well-equipped Berengar's garrison was, Arethes believed he might be able to import a great deal of iron into the empire from Tyrol, which would greatly aid the forces of the empire. He had no way of knowing that the blackened half-plate armor in which Berengar's forces wore was actually made out of quenched and tempered steel. After 3 days, the Byzantine nobleman returned to Berengar's castle and once more stood before him in the great hall. Berengar was the first to make conversation. "I am Count Berengar von Kufstein. You are here in my territory and have arrived unannounced. Be grateful for my benevolence, for I have granted you an audience despite the disrespect you have shown me." Just because Arethes was a man with a position similar to that of a duke did not mean that Berengar would back down. As such, he decided to emphasize that this meeting was solely due to his good nature and forgiveness. However, Arethes did not seem fazed by Berengar's posturing and reintroduced himself with a great deal of confidence. "I am Strategos Arethes Maniakos. I have traveled a great distance to establish trade with your region. I know that you have a great desire for silk, and I have a large supply of such a material that I am willing to trade. I promise you that if you make me your exclusive trading partner in this regard, I will give you a decent discount on the materials and will be able to fulfill your demand. I have even brought a large quantity of raw silk for you to browse and see if its quality is up to your standards." Berengar smiled upon hearing the news that the other party had a large amount of silk to sell. Acquiring silk for his ever-increasing textile industry's demands was becoming more difficult, incurring a rising expense and a lower profit margin. As such, he was more than happy to negotiate on a price with the man. Thus Berengar got up from his seat and walked down the steps from the platform where his seat of power was placed upon before standing in front of the man face to face. Berengar was quite a deal taller than Arethes, and as such, he was able to look down upon the man with a smug expression on his face. After arriving before the man, Berengar began to negotiate as he paced around Arethes. "Assuming you can fulfill your words and satisfy the ever-growing demand for silk, I will be willing to deal exclusively with you under the conditions that I receive a 15% discount. However, I would very much like to see your product before I come to any agreement." To Berengar, this was a reasonable request. After all, he would be buying in vast quantities and wanted a bulk discount, and such a discount was more than reasonable from the standards of his previous life. Of course, he was willing to negotiate a minimum of 10% off. However, what surprised him was that Arethes immediately agreed to his terms. "Such terms are acceptable to me. If you would like to browse my wares, we can go to the trade district in your city where I have left my supplies under the protection of my house guard." Thus Berengar motioned for a group of his guards standing by to follow him and Arethes into the city below, where they walked around for a bit, capturing the attention of the citizens who began to gossip about the scene. There were many rumors to be made about a lavishly dressed Eastern man conversing with Berengar, the Count of Tyrol. Berengar was well accustomed to such chatter. It was a common occurrence for the locals to gossip about him whenever he would take a stroll through the city, and as such, paid it no mind. Eventually, Arethes and Berengar reached his carts, which contained a massive supply of raw silk cloth. Berengar carefully inspected the material to see any obvious flaws. After a lengthy period of time, he finally smiled and nodded his hand. "If you can supply this quantity and quality of silk at regular intervals, I believe we can agree." Arethes returned Berengar's smile and stated with confidence that he would be able to meet his demands. "I can supply all of this and more every month. My merchant fleet can travel from Ionia to the Adriatic Sea, where they will then travel by caravan into Kufstein. As long as proper protection is provided for them when they enter through Austria, they will certainly arrive in Kufstein within that period of time." Berengar was instantly happy with this news. Finally, he could expand the trade of the more luxurious textiles and for a decent markup. His profit margins would increase with this deal, and he was pleased with it. After shaking the man's hand, Berengar invited Arethes to share a meal with him in his castle. "How about you stay in my castle for dinner tonight? I promise you that you will not regret the fine cuisine of Tyrol." After hearing the young count's offer, Arethes nodded his head in agreement. After all, the more friendly he became with Berengar, the more likely he could get his hands on some of his iron. As such, the shipment of silk was brought to Berengar's textile factories, where it would be converted into velvet and designed into fashionable clothing. Gold exchanged hands between the strategos and the young count. Eventually, they returned to the castle to share a meal to celebrate the new lucrative trade between their two territories. Unknowingly, this trade agreement would have important effects on the future of this world and the relationship between the rising German Empire and the Byzantines to the east. Chapter 149 Entertaining the Byzantines too. A small feast was thrown within the confines of the Castle of Kufstein. Sitting at the head of the table was Berengar, and by his side was Lind. At the table near Linda's position was Henrietta. The only other people present at the table were Arethas and a variety of Byzantine merchants and noblemen who traveled with his caravan. These men were allowed to dine at the table this night as a show of friendship to the Byzantines. Berengar was quite pleased that the Byzantine Empire maintained significant control over the Mediterranean in this timeline. In contrast, during his past life, they were on the brink of destruction at this point in history. This made establishing trade with the East much easier than dealing with a powerful Muslim empire. Even though the Byzantines were Orthodox, they were much more amicable in this world to the Catholics in the West than they were in their previous life, and as such, the two men were able to get along quite well. Especially because Berengar was secretly an atheist and had no plans to discriminate based upon what religion someone might adhere to. For the rest of the medieval world, this open-mindedness was uncommon, to say the least. Arethas and the merchants were dining on a variety of German cuisine, which Berengar had long since introduced into Kufstein and by now had spread across Austria and into Bavaria. The Byzantines were far more culturally advanced than their Western counterparts due to them being the surviving remnant of the ancient Roman Empire. Because of this, they were quite shocked that such a high level of culinary talent was available in a remote region like Tyrol. Seeing the satisfied expression on Arethas' face as he dug into the veal schnitzel, Berengar could not prevent himself from asking about the man's opinion. "So, what do you think about Tyrolean cuisine?" After being asked such a question, Arethas slowly chewed on the food and savored its taste before washing it down with a Doppelbock beer. Since Berengar first established his breweries, the first batch of Doppelbock beer had recently been released. As a beer connoisseur, Berengar was quite pleased with the result. It was apparent by the look on the Byzantine nobleman's face that he was not the only one who enjoyed the hearty taste of the strong German beer. It was only after several moments had passed and Arethas had time to enjoy the serving he had just devoured that he was able to answer Berengar's question. "Truly, it is sublime. I have not had such a fantastic foreign meal in years. The last time I had such an exquisite dish from a foreign country was when I visited India." Growing up in a globalized world from his previous life, Berengar was quite accustomed to Eastern-style foods. He was a big fan of curry from various countries, including India. As such, his mouth salivated thinking about having a curried rice dish. Berengar had once experimented with eating curried rice with tortilla chips in his previous life, acting as if the rice dish was a dip. It turned out to be quite tasty, at least in his opinion. Of course, everyone else thought he was a weirdo for doing such a thing. Thinking about such memories, Berengar could not wait for the point where he acquired some coastal territory to build a great fleet that could sail across Asia and acquire the spices necessary to recreate some of his favorite dishes from the continent. However, he was stuck in a landlocked region for now, and unless he expanded through force or coercion, he would not be able to acquire such valuable territory. Both of those options took time to prepare for. Arethas had his eyes on Lind for quite some time now. After all, she was an exceptional beauty, and as such, he could not stop himself from praising her. "Berengar, your wife is among the gorgeous women I have ever seen. You are a lucky man." Hearing herself be referred to as Berengar's wife, Lind began to blush as she shifted her attention to the food on the table. Berengar chuckled at Arethas' comment. However, he did not intend to spoil Linda's fun, and as such, did not clarify that she was, in fact, his lover, not his wife. "Lind is the mother of my child and the companion of my heart. As you say, I am truly a lucky man to have her by my side." Seeing as how Berengar did not correct Arethas, Lind decided to play the part of a dutiful wife and made her stance clear. "Berengar is the only man I will ever love. It is I who am grateful to be afforded the privilege to live by his side." Seeing the genuine expression on the exquisite young woman's face, Arethes mistook them for a happy newlywed couple and decided to shift the topic to something more important. Berengar, I do not intend to be rude, so forgive me if I am out of place, but I noticed a great deal of smoke rising from your industrial sector. I have also noticed your men are all equipped in plate armor. If you could humor my curiosity, just how much iron is produced in this city? With this question being raised, Berengar chuckled once more, though this time it was a bit more noticeable, and as such, Arethes frowned before asking Berengar. What is so funny? A proud smile appeared on Berengar's face as he began to correct the man. It is not iron in which my army is equipped with, but steel. My industrial sector produces a massive output of steel every month. The exact amount would shock you. Let's just say that I have more steel than I know what to do with at the moment. This was not an exaggeration in the slightest. With the new territory gained in his conquests and the city of Innsbruck being industrialized, Berengar was producing thousands of tons of steel every month, and despite using the steel in his many construction projects, which ranged from building fortifications, sewage treatment centers, roads, etc., as well as its extensive use in his arms industry, which supplied not only his own forces with the advanced equipment they wielded but also the medieval arms and armor of his allies. Berengar still had quite the surplus, albeit the more ambitious his plans became, the more the surplus dwindled. Hearing this information, Arethes instantly became excited by the news. Though he could not fathom how, if Berengar truly possessed the ability to create such a terrifying amount of steel, then clearly he could buy some of the raw materials for his own armies. As such, he began to ponder about the feasibility of such a deal. Is it possible for me to purchase some of your surplus? S. A smirk spread across Berengar's lips as he heard those words. Not only could he produce arms and armor for the factions fighting for Germany, but with this opportunity, he could partially supply the Byzantine armies who were fighting in Egypt. If negotiated properly, he could increase the business of his arms trade without putting his own position in danger. After all, no matter what type of armor he produced for the Byzantines, it would never stop his muskets, especially not the rifled muskets that utilized miniballs. Thus Berengar had no fear of trading arms and armor to the east. Seeing that Berengar was talking about business at the dinner table, the other merchants instantly became enlightened by the idea of purchasing some steel to be brought back to the empire for resale. As such, Berengar found himself bombarded with offers. However, before it could get too chaotic, he raised his hand, signaling the men to behave themselves. We are enjoying a meal right now. There will be plenty of time to discuss business opportunities in the upcoming days. Take this time to savor the dishes on the table, and think about what offers you wish to present me. What Berengar said was true. They had gotten ahead of themselves after the excitement they felt upon hearing that Berengar had a vast surplus of steel. After all, it was a tough material to make in this era, and only ever in small quantities. If Berengar truly possessed such a stockpile of the valuable material, they would be willing to go to great lengths to secure a trade agreement with the young count. As such, the remainder of the dinner was spent discussing less important matters and the ongoing events of the world. For a region embroiled in warfare, Tyrol was remarkably secure for the moment. Thus, while the rest of Germany suffered through the hardships of war, Berengar entertained a host of Byzantine merchants and noblemen from the east. Chapter 150 Marvels of Industry I. After the feast was over, Berengar saw his guests off to the quarters they were staying in his city. He had made quite an impression on these Byzantine noblemen and merchants, and in the following days, would make sure to negotiate proper trade agreements with every one of them. The more contacts he made in the east, the better his business would become. After reclaiming much of their lost territories since the Crusades had begun, the Byzantine Empire was wealthy, far more than a region like Germany. After all, they were in the center of trade between the west and the east. Though the Byzantines had to repel Saracen invasions a couple of times a decade, for the most part, their power was stable, and Berengar saw an opportunity in building relations with them. As such, he made sure to take care of his guests during this feast. After sending the men off, he returned to his castle, where he sat down and had a glass of wine alongside his beautiful young lover. The wine was a gift from the Byzantine Empire and was of significant quality, thus Berengar wanted to have a taste of it. After swirling the wine around in his chalice and inhaling the thick aroma, Berengar sipped upon the fine alcohol before nodding his head in approval. The Byzantines sure know how to make a good wine. On the other hand, Lind had some questions on her mind and was not afraid to speak of them. As such, she quickly asked Berengar about his intentions. You sure seem to be treating these men from the east quite well. Do you intend to establish an arms trade with the Byzantines? Berengar smiled and nodded his head before explaining his plans. The eastern half of the Roman Empire was always its wealthiest region, with much of their lands reclaimed. The Byzantines have amassed quite a fortune over the previous centuries. Due to being near the Saracens, they are constantly under threat of invasion and spend a large amount of wealth on their military. Now that they know I have a substantial supply of steel, when they return to the east and spread the news of this, the generals of the Byzantine armies will be begging me to supply their forces with high-quality equipment. Berengar estimated that the Byzantines would most likely be victorious in their ongoing war with Egypt and reap great spoils from the region, further increasing their wealth. As such, he intended to get on their good side and make as much money from their wars as possible. Wars were a profitable business to those who had the means to take advantage of them. Lind carefully observed Berengar's estimation before nodding her head in agreement. What Berengar said was most likely true, and getting in the good graces of the Byzantine Empire provided substantial benefits. As such, she complimented him on his schemes. You really think everything through, don't you? Berengar chuckled as he took a swig from his glass of wine before responding. Not everything, but I try to be a few steps ahead of my potential rivals. Make no mistake, in the future, when I have united my German Empire, the Byzantines will be a rival for global hegemony. At the rate they are expanding, they could become a threat if relations are not properly maintained. Luckily for Berengar, he knew about the New World and the resource-rich regions of Africa, most of which were sparsely populated and posed no major threat to an advanced army like his own. After unifying his empire, he would take advantage of his knowledge and lay claim to the best regions in the world for colonization. By the time the Byzantine Empire and the other powers realized the value of these regions, the critical areas would already be under German sovereignty. Lind saw the proud expression on Berengar's face but could not read his mind, and as such, did not know what he was smirking about. However, she knew when it came to Berengar and his ambitions that it was best not to overstep her bounds, and as such, she decided to switch the topic. So, will you be showing the merchants your steel stockpile? Snapping back to reality from Linda's words, Berengar quickly nodded his head in response and smiled once more. Of course, they need to know just how much I can produce so that they can brag to the empire about my steel surplus. The greater the surplus, the larger the interest the empire will have for my steel. I will show them the extent of my people's labor tomorrow. It will be sure to leave a lasting impression on these merchants and noblemen from the east. With that said, the two lovers quickly finished their wine before returning to their bedchambers, where they embraced each other passionately for many hours into the long night. After the sun rose in the morning, Berengar got up and began his daily routine. It was well past noon when he finally met with Arethes and the others in the city below. After meeting up with Arethes, Berengar patted the man on the back with a wide grin on his face. Come, let me show you the extent of my industry. Hearing these words, a flash of greed filled the eyes of the merchants from the east who surrounded Berengar like a flock of hungry buzzards. Berengar knew what they were thinking about from the gleam in their pupils. Unfortunately for them, he would not allow them to see the machinery used to create such a massive stockpile of steel, only the results of production. As such, Berengar led the men through the industrial district of Kufstein, whose secrets were heavily guarded by the garrison. Only properly authorized personnel was allowed through the gates, but since these men traveled with Berengar, they were easily able to pass by the strict security. After all, Berengar owned this entire city. Berengar made sure to give the men a tour of the industrial district outside of the critical areas of development. As such, the armories and arms factories were the first he showed. Of course, he showed the factories which explicitly produced equipment for export, not the manufacture of his own supplies. Seeing such a large warehouse filled with hundreds of employees working in well-organized assembly lines to create sets of brigandine and plate armor, the Byzantine merchants were shocked by the size of the operation. Berengar smiled smugly at the expressions on their faces before introducing the area. This is the armory, where we manufacture brigandine and plate armor for export to our customers. Of course, if you desire a different armor style, we could also manufacture that for you. From my understanding, the Byzantine army uses a mixture of mail and mirror pattern armor, and I would be more than happy to craft such equipment if an agreement can be reached. Mirror pattern armor was a style of armor used by Eastern forces. It consisted of a group of interlocking iron plates, usually in the form of circles and squares, which protected the torso. These plates were grouped together by riveted mail rings. Generally speaking, the mirror pattern armor was worn over a mail hauberk. Berengar produced very little mail armor because it was a time-consuming practice, far more so than brigandine and plate. He would honestly prefer to introduce this Western style of equipment to the Byzantine forces, but that was not his decision to make. Seeing the grand scale of equipment production, Arethes felt the need to ask about where such supplies would be sold off to. Just who is your customer for such a large supply of equipment? Berengar smiled and did not hide that this equipment was custom-ordered and paid for by the Duke of Austria and his vassals. My largest customer at the moment is Count Otto of Steiermark. However, Duke Wilmar has recently begun placing orders for his personal armies as well. Luckily for him, he came into a large supply of weapons and armor from the late Count Lothar and his armies. Due to the size and speed of my industry, he has given me the task of repairing and outfitting the equipment for his purposes. However, a lot of this is also new production. As the war goes on, the demand for more equipment expands. The sight of the armory left a lasting impression on Arethes, and he could hardly believe his eyes. Of course, when the Byzantine noblemen and merchants arrived at their next destination, they would be equally shocked by the scale of industry in which Berengar had fostered in Kufstein. If the mighty strategos knew that Kufstein was just one of Berengar's industrial cities and that Innsbruck had been developing its own industrial sector, he would truly lose his mind in astonishment. Chapter 151 Marvels of Industry 2. After showing the Byzantine noblemen and merchants the armory, Berengar quickly walked into the next area of the industrial sector, which housed the arms factory. There were 2 of such facilities in Kufstein. Much like the armories, they had been split into production for local forces, and production of arms for export. The export arms factory was also manned by many workers, who utilized trip hammers and other water-powered machinery to pound the steel ingots into the shapes of swords, spears, war hammers, polearms, arrowheads, etc. Arethes witnessed the final process of creating a halberd in the hands of one of the workers. It was stacked neatly onto a pallet filled with hundreds of other halberds, which would later be inspected for quality control, and only after the shipment was fully inspected and tested would they be shipped out to their customers. Berengar knew the importance of quality control, and as such, he did his best to maintain the quality of his equipment. Each piece of equipment approved for export was given a proof mark shaped like the letter K, symbolizing that it had been manufactured and received approval for shipment within the factories of Kufstein. This process, of course, was also used on the equipment for his own forces, but that was not important at the moment. Berengar began to introduce the facility to the merchants as if he was a standard tour guide who had repeated this phrase 100 times before. This is the arms factory used to produce weapons from the steel manufactured in the city. Each piece of equipment, much like the armor in our armories, is inspected for quality before it is shipped out to our customers. If it fails to meet our standards, it is recycled into the steel plants and manufactured into something new. I have stringent guidelines about quality control to ensure that each piece of equipment manufactured in our factories is truly fit for the stresses of battle. The idea of strict quality control was something Berniger had taken from his previous life and was not generally used in this timeline, at least not to the degree to which he had implemented it. Seeing such a massive stockpile of weapons being loaded onto wooden pallets, the Byzantine merchants and noblemen were practically salivating at sight. They all wanted to get their hands on the arms in front of them, where they could be sold in the empire for a large profit or used to outfit their own troops. Berengar had yet to show the actual warehouse which housed his steel surplus, but he had already captured the interests of the men from the east. From the looks in their eyes, he could tell they would spread this news across the empire, and Berengar would gain various new customers. Arethes, in particular, could not wait to return home and inform the department in charge of procuring equipment for the army about such a massive opportunity. After all, the Byzantine Empire was a highly complex imperial bureaucracy. A general could not just outfit his troops with new equipment out of nowhere. It first had to be approved by the bureaucrats in charge of logistics. After showing off the armory and arms factory, Berengar finally dragged the men over to the warehouse which housed the steel surplus. After opening it up and displaying the full might of his industrial capacity, the merchants and noblemen were absolutely shocked. The warehouse was roughly 5,000 square feet and contained piles of steel ingots stacked to the roof. The amount of steel in this facility was in the thousands of tons. This was the surplus that had been gathered after months of production from the Bessemer converters. Seeing the sight before him, Aretha's eyes nearly fell out of his sockets. His jaw dropped to the point where it nearly unhinged itself. He could not fathom so much steel in one place. Steel was a scarce commodity, and yet Berengar had produced such a vast quantity of it. He could not understand why so much steel was needed. After all, the idea of using steel in structures was not something that had been invented outside of Berengar's domain. The steel ingots themselves were sorted into different areas based upon their composition and purpose. Structural steel, armor steel, weapon steels, tool steels, and galvanized steel ingots were properly organized in their own sections. If one were not familiar with this organization, one would think that all the steel was the same. After confirming that they were looking at reality, the Byzantine merchants and noblemen recovered their senses and instantly began thinking about taking advantage of this. The merchants, in particular, wanted to resell this steel for an exorbitant price and instantly began making offers to Berengar. One fat and bald man, in particular, approached Berengar with a smile on his face as if the young count was his benefactor. "Count Berengar, what would it take for me to acquire a small amount of this steel to bring back with me to the empire?" Seeing the way the man was looking at him made Berengar uncomfortable. However, he knew the value of the steel and the man's plans. As such, he made a figure he felt was appropriate. "I will accept 1 pound of silver for every ton of steel you wish to buy." This number was quite high, considering 150 pounds of iron could be sold in England for 4 shillings, each shilling being roughly 1/20th a pound of silver. However, this was not iron but readily manufactured steel, and Berengar held a monopoly on it. There was nowhere else in the world the man would be able to get such a vast quantity of steel. For reference, in the modern world from Berengar's past life, 1 ton of steel ingots was worth anywhere between $1,000 to $1,500, whereas 1 avoirdupois pound of silver was worth roughly $345. However, silver was much scarcer in this time period, and as such, its inherent worth was much higher than 21st century America, but then again, so was steel. The smiling face of the fat merchant quickly receded to a scowl as he heard Berengar's offer. It was quite a large sum of money, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he could charge an even greater price when he resold it, as for the time being, he would be one of the few men capable of bringing such a vast quantity of steel back to the empire. However, the man still tried to negotiate the price with Berengar. "How about 1/2 pound of silver?" However, Berengar shook his head in refusal and clarified his position. 1 pound of silver for 1 ton of steel. That is my offer." Everyone in the room knew that Berengar had a monopoly on such a high quantity of steel, and he could dictate the price as he pleased. Even if these merchants were unwilling to pay the price, someone would, and as such, Berengar took full advantage of that to pressure these merchants. Eventually, they gritted their teeth and bought a large steel supply to bring back to the empire. Of course, they did not have such a vast quantity of silver on them, and as such, they would have to go back to the empire, get the silver, and then return to Kufstein to complete the transaction. However, such a trip was worth it when the profit they could make from the steel was massive. After concluding the initial transaction, Berengar completed the tour of his industrial district and captured the interests of the Byzantine merchants and noblemen. They had no idea how Berengar had managed to accomplish it as he kept them away from the Bessemer converters. Still, he had such a large stockpile of steel. If they were his neighbors, they would be tempted to invade. However, due to the distance between the empire and Tyrol, it was not something they could easily do. As such, the Byzantines spent some time in Tyrol getting accustomed to Berengar before returning to the empire, though they would be back shortly with plenty of silver to trade for Berengar's steel. Berengar, on the other hand, was rather happy about the deals he had made. He had secured a new market, and with it, another fortune. For now, he went back to preparing his armies for the upcoming war with the Teutonic Order, as well as overseeing the construction of his star fortresses and monuments. The work of a tyrant was never complete. Chapter 152 Show him no mercy. Nearly 2 months had passed since Berengar concluded his business with the Byzantines, and since then, another shipment of silk had entered Kufstein as promised. During this time period, the other merchants eager to get their hands on some of Berengar's steel had made their round trip with enough silver to make Berengar an even more wealthy man. However, The most important part of what had happened during this time was the Teutonic Order's progress by crossing through Bavaria. They would soon reach the Bavarian Alps, where they would enter into Tyrol, and Berengar intended to lay a trap for them within the narrow passages of the mighty mountain range. Berengar was once more tasked with the responsibility to go to war. However, this time, it would be a far shorter campaign. At the moment, he was dressed in his exquisite armor, which had once more changed to fit battle conditions. He wore a 3/4 blackened steel plate harness. However, under the armor was a back-end steel mail hauberk with brass rings on the bottom layers of the sleeves. Over his hands were an exquisite pair of 16th-century style plate gauntlets whose fingers were segmented and were blackened while sharing the elegant gold pattern that was on his armor. Over his cuirass, he wore a matching gold sash and a black sword belt with gold fittings that contained his majestic heavy cavalry saber. He no longer wore the signature Waffenrock in the past, and his armored codpiece was on full display over his black and gold Landsknecht-style trousers. The armored codpiece matched the pattern on the rest of his armor. For footwear, he wore a pair of cavalry boots that folded at his knees. As for his helmet, he had switched from the skullcap and the feathered cap to a more traditional German-style bergonet, which had 3 rims atop its skull instead of the usual one. Of course, it was embellished with the same intricate gold pattern on the rest of his armor. Seeing her lover geared up for war again, Lind could not help but frown. Her strawberry blonde hair was now much longer and overflowed past her shoulders, her bangs were straight, and a strand of her hair was tied over the back of her long red gold curtain. If anything, with this new hairstyle, she was even more beautiful than before. She held the baby Hans in her hands as she pouted at Berengar, who was leaving her so quickly after returning from the war in Tyrol. Berengar closed the distance between her and himself and brought her into his metallic embrace before kissing her passionately. After releasing his grasp, Lind spoke the words in her heart. "Show him no mercy." Berengar nodded with a serious expression on his face. He had already made the mistake of allowing Lambert to live, which had brought serious consequences. An army of over 30,000 men was at his doorstep, with his scoundrel of a little brother at its head. Though he had roughly half the amount of men, he would be riding into battle to meet Lambert and end this sibling rivalry once and for all. After bidding farewell to his lover and child, Berengar walked out into his castle's courtyard, where he mounted his mighty steed Erwin and prepared to meet up with his army, which was already assembled within the city gates of Kufstein. After meeting up with his army at the rallying point, Berengar noticed the magnificence of his army. Many of the veterans had been recalled from their positions as garrisons and replaced with the recruits. After all, having veterans in his army to maintain order and discipline was crucial to victory, especially against an army as large as Lambert's. Standing before Berengar were roughly 15,000 men, 10,000 of which were infantry, all clad in the brilliant display of black, gold, and white attire, with blackened steel half-plate armor and bergonets. As for the NCOs, their armor was lined with a simple brass trimming, and the officers had a more embellished brass trimming on their armor which allowed his ranks to identify the men in charge and follow their orders quickly. Roughly half of the infantry were equipped with the 1417 18th rifled musket. The others still used the standard 1417 land pattern musket, smoothbore. As for the remaining 5,000 men, it was a mix of cuirassiers and artillery. When compared to the army of Lambert's, which, aside from 10,000 men, was filled with mere peasant levies, Berengar's forces were far more impressive. With this sight, Berengar began to get the feeling that his vision for a grand army that would put Napoleon's elite forces to shame was beginning to take shape. After arriving at the head of the formation, Berengar gave the order to his men, who were waiting patiently. Forward march. With that declared, Berengar's army was once more on the march to war. The citizens of Kufstein gathered on both sides of the marching army to show their support, fully realizing that many of these young men would not be returning. As such, flowers were laid at the army's feet that began to march towards the Bavarian Alps. Riding alongside Berengar was his field marshal Eckhard von Hallstatt. He was the one who devised the plan to meet the Teutonic army in the mountains and ambush them. With the superior range and the treacherous terrain, Berengar and his forces would be able to take full advantage of the situation and inflict mass casualties on the enemy before they were able to clash with his forces in melee combat. The more enemies that could be killed at the range, the better. Berengar, of course, was still apprehensive about the plan considering how vastly outnumbered they were. As such, he voiced his concerns to Eckhard. "Are you sure about this? If they enter through a different region, we will be leaving our flanks open." Eckhard put on a solemn expression as he assured Berengar of his plan's success. Munich has fallen into the hands of Duke Otto. Unless he wants to clash with the Austrian armies, Lambert will have to circumvent them. They will go through Swabia, specifically through Oberstdorf, to reach Tyrol. Rest assured, our scouts have already reported seeing them in the area. When they enter the mountains, we will be lying in wait for them. There will be no escape. Hearing how confident Eckhard was, Berengar let out a sigh of relief. Despite being a decent strategist and tactician himself, Eckhard was the true prodigy in the art of war, and if the field marshal was so certain of this battle's outcome, then Berengar had nothing to fear. As such, the young count continued on his journey. With this, Berengar and his army would soon meet the Teutonic army in brutal conflict. Ever since Berengar opted to spare Lambert's life, he knew the decision would come back to bite him in the rear, and the chickens have finally come home to roost. Only blood could resolve this sibling conflict that had been brewing for so long. Chapter 153: Ambushing the Teutonic Order. After marching for a few days, Berengar and his army arrived at the passage in Oberstdorf that led into Tyrol. Due to the ongoing war in Germany, specifically with the Austrian conquest of Bavaria, the Teutonic Knights were forced to take a narrow and more treacherous path on the western region of Bavaria, which was part of the proud Duchy of Swabia. As Berengar entered the mountainous path with a relatively narrow ravine, he ordered his troops to set up their artillery higher than the pass below. Hiding among the tree line of the mountainside, Berengar's troops lay in wait, ready to ambush Lambert's forces. They had received information from their scouts that Lambert and his forces would be walking into the trap they had set within a matter of hours. As such, Berengar kept careful watch over the mountain pass where his troops had set themselves up in a position to trap Lambert and his armies. There would be no escape from the encirclement they had set up, and Berengar could not forgive Lambert for the transgressions he had made against him. Berengar had spared Lambert's life at the behest of his mother and given him a chance to redeem himself. However, Lambert did not appreciate his mercy and decided to spit in his face by marching an army into Berengar's lands. This could not be tolerated. There would be no mercy shown to the enemy today. Before long, Berengar could hear the march of an army of Teutonic soldiers singing their Catholic hymns. The white banners with the infamous Black Cross of the Teutonic Order were waving in the background as they marched through the narrow pass. Seeing the enemy before them, Berengar's troops prepared their rifles as they hid behind the tall trees, using them as cover. Only when the enemy was fully trapped in the encirclement did Berengar's troops begin to fire. The distance between Berengar's armies and Lambert's were a few hundred meters, easy enough for the thousands of rifled musketeers to rain fire down on the unsuspecting Teutonic Order. The critical targets were the knights and men-at-arms under Lambert's command, so the initial volley was centered on the well-armored forces who would prove more difficult to kill in melee combat. Lambert, who was riding at the head of the army, was shocked when he heard the explosive gunfire echo into the air. Instantly, thousands of musket shots were fired, causing chaos, death, and destruction upon his ranks. Lambert was completely caught in a crossfire by both sides of the mountains. The effect of the musket balls tearing through his knights and men-at-arms was devastating. Though Lambert was unharmed, his horse was hit by one of the mini balls and tumbled to the ground. By the time Lambert had recovered from his position on the ground, the second wave of musket shots had fired off, shredding his armies once more. Realizing that these were the weapons of Berengar and that he had walked right into his brother's trap, Lambert boldly declared his armies to charge to the tree line where the enemy was hiding. As soon as the Teutonic Order made their way to the tree line, they began to be battered by the dozens of cannons placed in the mountains above, firing on the foothills below with their explosive shells. Yet Lambert paid no heed to them and instead rallied his forces. Into the forest, they would never fire upon their own lines. As such, the tens of thousands of levies were pushed forward by the remaining members of the Teutonic Order, who were not slaughtered in the initial volley. Despite being well equipped with rifled muskets, 300+ meter targets were still a difficulty for many of the soldiers equipped with such technology, and many of the projectiles missed their mark. As such, there were still thousands of heavily armed Teutonic soldiers marching into the forest to engage Berengar's forces in melee combat. Berengar had yet to deploy the cavalry. Instead, they would act as the units that would encircle Lambert's forces if they attempted to flee the ravine. As such, he calmly sat atop Erwin's saddle and waited for the battle to turn interesting. After suffering thousands of casualties in the initial fighting, Lambert remained undeterred. He had over 30,000 men at his back, and it became quickly apparent that Berengar had at most 10,000 men under his command. If he could close the distance, he would win by the sheer volume of numbers, or so he hoped. As such, Lambert quickly advanced towards the enemy, unafraid of the oncoming projectiles as he led his troops into battle. Whether he was simply lucky or blessed by God, Lambert arrived at the enemy lines in the forests screaming at the top of his lungs the battle cry of so many crusaders. God wills it. However, what he was met with was the battle cry of Berengar's soldiers as they rushed towards him and his armies with bayonets affixed. God with us. The two chants of the armies perfectly contrasted their worldview as a grand melee began to unfold. Despite Lambert's overwhelming numbers, Berengar's forces had completely encircled them and began to push them back into the ravine. After all, many of Lambert's army were forcefully conscripted levies, and hundreds if not thousands of them had already broken ranks the moment they came under fire. They were simple peasants, and seeing such death and destruction, which resulted from thunderous echoes, they could not help but fear they were being punished by God's wrath and thus fled for their lives. Despite the fleeing levies, many of them remained, and as such, Berengar's forces were still greatly outnumbered. Thus the two armies clashed against one another in a valley between the Bavarian Alps on the border of Austria. The blood and chaos that followed would prove to be an inspiration for the future artists of this world. The only men who remained calm during this sea of bloodshed were Berengar and Eckhard, who gazed upon the battle from afar, watching the Teutonic Order play right into their hands. Chapter 154. My dear brother. As the Teutonic Order and Berengar's army clashed in the field below, Berengar gazed upon the bloody scene with a smirk. Everything was going according to plan. Berengar investigated the melee below through a spyglass, desperately searching for Lambert's location. Unfortunately for him, Lambert was clad in a full set of plate armor, and his great bassinet's visor was down. As such, it was not easy to spot him in the chaotic scene. Lambert, on the other hand, was currently engaging in combat against one of Berengar's infantrymen. As the soldier thrust his bayonet at Lambert's direct, the boy swiftly dodged the strike and lunged with his longsword piercing through the gap in the man's helmet and into his eyes, killing him on the spot. Lambert had trained his whole life in the art of combat, and though bayonet training was much simpler than the sword against a true master, it was too easy to cut down Berengar's professional army. The surviving knights of the Order's army surrounded Lambert, and they engaged in brutal combat with Berengar's soldiers. When grouped together, they made an easy target for the grenadier, one of which lobbed a grenade into the mix that detonated shortly after, shredding the nearby knights and forcing the others to redirect their efforts into protecting their flanks. Lambert was too busy in combat to realize that the explosive blast had torn the visor of his helmet, revealing his face, which was spotted from afar by Berengar and his spyglass. A wicked grin appeared on Berengar's face as he spotted Lambert from a great distance. There you are, little brother. It is time to pay for your sins. After putting away his spyglass, Berengar unsheathed his heavy cavalry sword and pulled out one of the pistols from his saddle before declaring to his cavalry forces in a loud shout, God with us. The infamous battle cry was the signal for the charge. As such, thousands of cuirassiers began to descend on the encircled Teutonic Order from both sides of the ravine. Before long, a new wave of gunfire was unleashed by the pistols in their hands as they charged into the fray. The stray bullets went in many directions. Due to the chaotic situation, it was unknown whether or not any of Berengar's forces were injured or killed by friendly fire. However, the attack was effective in breaking open a path into the melee. After crashing into the wall of steel, which was the Teutonic Order's forces, the cavalry began to cut their way through the massive horde of enemies. Berengar was leading his forces straight to Lambert, who was busy fighting off the ranks of Berengar's grenadier, who were a far more elite group of soldiers than the standard line infantry, and as such, presented a greater challenge for him and his knights. However, before Berengar could reach Lambert, the chaos of battle affected his trajectory. While he was rushing towards his brother on horseback, a lucky spear thrust through the gaps in Erwin's armor and pierced itself into the horse's hide, gravely injuring the mighty beast. Berengar fell to the ground amidst the chaos and found himself surrounded by the spearmen, where he quickly deflected the oncoming blow into his breastplate, which he knew would prevent its advance, and used this time to stab the 38-inch blade of his Damascus steel sword into the Crusader's eye socket. Berengar certainly had a reach advantage, as his single-handed sword was greater in blade length than most longswords. As such, he adeptly moved from his position after killing the man and slashed into the poorly guarded torso of a levy who got in his path. Seeing the target of his ire was only a few yards in front of him, Berengar shouted out above the chaotic sounds of battle in a voice so loud it would even garner Lambert's attention, whose longsword was currently bound with the bayonet of a grenadier. Lambert, I've come for your head." Noticing the voice of his brother taunting him in the distance, Lambert quickly unbound from the grenadier's bayonet and stuck his blade through the man's face before gazing over at Berengar, who stood a few yards away next to his dead horse. Lambert instantly charged at his older brother while calling out to him, "Today, you will die by my blade, Berengar. Why could you not just die peacefully in your sleep from the poison? Instead, you have taken everything from me." Berengar grinned wickedly as he clashed with Lambert's longsword. What the boy said was true. Berengar had taken everything from him, but in his eyes, it was the price to pay for plotting against him so many times. As such, he felt no guilt for his actions. Lambert quickly slashed at Berengar, which the garishly outfitted Count parried. Berengar counter-attacked with a lunge which Lambert swiftly dodged. Finally, the lessons of swordsmanship in which Berniger had so painstakingly engaged in every day for the last year were beginning to show their effects. As the battle waged around these two commanders, Lambert and Berengar danced with their swords. However, after a while, it soon became apparent that despite the advantages Berengar's sword had over a traditional longsword, he was not nearly skilled enough to keep up with Lambert. Eventually, a vertical slash passed through Berengar's defense, and right under the protection of his burgonet, grazing past his right eye, cutting through the soft tissue and spilling his blood on the ground. Berengar reeled in pain as the sting of the cut electrified his brain. Despite losing his vision in his dominant eye, Berengar desperately tried to raise his sword in defense. Instead, the sword was quickly disarmed from his hand, and he was kicked by Lambert's steel-clad foot onto the ground, lying against the corpse of his once proud destrier. 16 years. 16 years I have had to watch you make a fool of yourself and our family. The sheer damage you did to the von Kufstein name throughout your life through your childish fits of anger and indolent behavior was enough to set back our family's prestige by generations. Can you honestly blame me for wanting to kill you and take your position? I would never have imagined that I would have actually succeeded on my first attempt and invite a demon into our midst." Hearing the last few words of Lambert's monologue made Berengar break out in uncontrolled laughter. Despite losing sight in his right eye and bleeding profusely from the wound, Berengar could not contain himself. Seeing his older brother seemingly lose his sanity in the moment before his death, Lambert instinctively lowered his defenses and questioned Berengar for his odd behavior. "What is so funny?" Berengar stopped laughing and glared at Lambert like a demon mocking a mortal for being foolish enough to believe that they had cornered him. As his lips curled up into a sinister sneer, Berengar spoke in a chilling tone to Lambert. "Oh, my dear brother? You have no idea how right you are." With that, Berengar quickly grabbed the remaining pistol from Irwin's saddle and cocked the hammer while pointing it at Lambert's chest, which was not 3 feet away. Berengar was only a second faster than Lambert as the boy reacted to Berengar's actions by lifting his sword into the air with a killing blow. The thunder of the flintlock pistol exploded into the air as the musket ball within left the barrel's chamber and flew point blank into Lambert's breastplate before passing through it and into the youth's heart. Lambert's slash came down upon Berengar, but due to the damage dealt by the musket ball to the young Teutonic knight, the trajectory of the sword was altered and slashed into the steel armor that was atop Irwin's corpse before Lambert himself fell to the ground bleeding out from his wounded heart. Berengar used this opportunity to clamber to his feet before grabbing a hold of his sword. Due to the damage inflicted upon his right eye and the difference in depth perception, it took him a few attempts to get a hold of it. Afterward, Berengar walked over to his brother and gazed upon him as he slowly bled to death. In the process he removed the boy's helmet before saying something Lambert would never expect. "I really have to thank you, Lambert. If you had not poisoned this body to the brink of death, I might not have been able to enter this world. For that, you have my sincerest gratitude. However, the moment I came into this world, there was only one of 2 ways this would end. With my death or yours, and unfortunately for you, the entity you brought into this earth is beyond your comprehension. A bit of advice from one who has already pierced the veil. Try to do better in your next life. After hearing these words, life finally faded from Lambert's eyes as he entered the void. Whether or not he would be reincarnated, Berengar did not know. After all, even after experiencing death, Berengar saw neither heaven nor hell. He simply awoke in another body. It was completely unknown to him if that was everyone's fate or a one-time thing. Lambert had passed from this world in a state of total fear and confusion. He genuinely died believing that Berengar was possessed by a demon, one in which he had personally brought into the world. Berengar, on the other hand, had merely spoken the truth, albeit in a deliberately vague way to mess with Lambert's mind one last time. Chapter 155 cut off his head. Despite Lambert's death, the battle continued to wage on. Of course, in the middle of the chaos and bloodshed, nobody noticed that the commander of the Teutonic Order lay dead on the ground, not at first at least. However, the surrounding Teutonic knights and grenadier quickly realized that their commanders were missing and gazed over to see Berengar wounded in one eye, staring down at his brother's corpse. You would think that the sight of their commander dying would weaken the Crusaders' resolve. However, it only enhanced it. The heretic had killed his own brother. That was a grave sin, and as such, their zealotry took hold of them as they began to make their way to Berengar to avenge the loss of their commander. However, the grenadier quickly halted the knights' advance to put their bayonets in their path and formed a wall between the enemy and their commander. A fierce clash broke out between Berengar's grenadier and the knights of the Teutonic Order. Despite the knights being clad head to toe in plate armor, they soon found themselves being gunned down by a few of the rifled musketeers who stayed in the tree line and sniped the enemy targets from afar. These men were Berengar's marksmen and would one day become his Jaeger Corps. For now, they pelted the heavily armored knights with lead projectiles while they clashed with the grenadier. Eventually, the melee seemed to turn in favor of Berengar's army. After all, their commander was dead, and at this point, Berengar and his army had slaughtered the majority of the knights and men at arms. As for the levies, they no longer had the resolve to fight. As such, entire ranks of levies dropped their weapons as they realized they were greatly outmatched by the skill of Berengar's line infantry and their bayonets. Noticing the decrease in knights and men at arms, Berengar shouted to the chaotic battlefield as loud as possible. Any levy who turns on the Teutonic Order will be spared the death in which I have reserved for them. Berengar's officers and NCOs quickly relayed this news across the melee to the point where most of the levies had taken up arms against the men who forced them into this deadly conflict. There was no love lost between the levies and the Teutonic Order, and given the option, they would gladly backstab the knights and men at arms who forced them out of their homes and away from their families into this slaughter. Despite being surrounded by Berengar's forces and subjected to the treason of their levies, the Teutonic Order's zealotry was to be commended as they fought to the last man, taking as many enemies as they could with them. For a crusader, surrendering to a heretic was worse than death, and these men exemplified that ideal. Before long, the Teutonic Order's army was completely wiped out down to the last man, yet the damage done to Berengar's forces was immense. He had lost well over 2,000 men in the conflict. After all, the heavily armored knights had an enormous advantage in melee combat. After the battle was over, Eckhard approached Berengar, whose wounds were being treated by a field medic. It stung like hell, but the distilled alcohol disinfected the wound to his right eye, and series of linen bandages were wrapped around it. For now, that was the best treatment he could receive. Seeing Berengar was rather calm about the whole situation, Eckhard asked him an important question on his mind. "What should we do with the remains of your brother?" Berengar thought about it for a few moments before a wicked idea formed in his head. Berengar's own arrogance had gotten the better of him in this conflict. He had charged towards his brother's position expecting to kill him easily. In the end, the price of his victory was that of his dominant eye and the life of his trusted steed. He needed a memento mori, a symbol to remind him that no matter what he accomplishes in life, he is only human and that death is inevitable. As such, he gave Eckhard a barbaric decree, one which made the man question the sanity of his lord and commander. Cut off his head and bring it to me. I will have his skull turned into a golden chalice. As for the rest of his body, bury it in the mass grave with the rest of these foolish crusaders. Eckhard was immediately taken back by the notion. Such a thing was not uncommon during the Dark Ages. However, the idea of decapitating someone and turning their skull into a drinking cup was a savage and barbaric notion during this time period. Still, the veteran knight knew better than to disobey one of Berengar's commands. As such, he ordered some of the more unstable men in the army to perform the evil deed. As for the levies they gathered before Berengar, after all, they were captured by Berengar's troops after the conflict was over and awaited his orders. Though he promised to spare them if they fought for him, one could never know if the young count would keep his word. Seeing the destitute peasants forced into the armies of the Teutonic Order and compelled to fight against him, Berengar felt a great deal of pity for them, and as such, he rose from his seat. The bloody bandage over his right eye marred his otherwise charismatic appearance. Berengar gave a command for all of the levies to hear. "I hold no ill will towards any of you. You all were forced against your will to fight against me and were dragged away from your families without your consent. Yet despite this, you have given me aid in this conflict, and as such I will reward you. Go home, and spread the word of my merciful and righteous actions." With that said, the surviving levies of the Teutonic Order's army were freed and allowed to return to their homes, though some of them were not as lucky as the others. Many of them were wounded and would die of infection on their path back to their homes. However, Berengar had limited medical supplies, and he was far from a saint. The fact that he had spared their lives despite taking up arms against him was in itself mercy. After all, these men were not his enemies. If they were, he would never allow them to see the light of another day. For Berengar had learned a valuable lesson about showing mercy to one's enemies, a mistake he would never repeat so long as he drew breath in this world. Chapter 156 Recovery. At the moment, Berengar was sitting in his castle, having his eye looked over by his court physician Ewald. It had been a few days since his return from the battlefield, and his injury was well maintained due to the disinfectants used on it. Despite the horrendous nature of medieval medicine, the man seemed to be somewhat competent. Having trained in his earlier years in the Byzantine Empire, he had access to many of the more enlightened views of medicine from the classical era and the golden age of Islam. As such, he carefully observed Berengar's right eye, which had a vertical slash through it. Though the cut was not deep enough to kill, it had severed his retina and potentially the optical nerve. Of course, Ewald did not know such advanced information. After observing it, he made his diagnosis. The eye itself will heal, albeit heavily scarred, but you will never be able to see from it again. I suggest you get yourself accustomed to life with only half of your vision before you go on any further campaigns. Receiving this news made Berengar frown with discontent. As for Lind, she was nearby holding her lover's hand throughout the process. She was more anxious about the results than Berengar himself was. Ultimately, Berengar sighed heavily before expressing his views on the matter. "Such is the price of my arrogance." Ever since he had become wounded, Berengar greatly reflected on his prior actions. Despite knowing the danger, and the ability of his brother's swordsmanship, Berengar rushed into the fray, truly believing he could contend with Lambert after only a year's worth of training. After all, he had been overwhelmingly victorious in all his previous conflicts. How could this one possibly be any different? Such hubris had cost him dearly. The price of Berengar's victory over the Teutonic Order was steep. He lost roughly 3,000 men in the battle, his faithful steed Erwin, as well as the function of his dominant eye. After hearing what Ewald had to say, Berengar dismissed him where he was left alone with Lind, who placed a fresh bandage covered in a basic antibiotic ointment. Since the day that the alchemists arrived in Kufstein and began learning chemistry, Berengar had placed them in charge of more than just creating TNT. In fact, a large amount of the chemicals they produced thanks to Berengar's future knowledge was for medical purposes, such as neomycin, bacitracin, and polymyxin, which were antibiotics used in over-the-counter antibiotic ointment in Berengar's previous life. The worst part of an injury like this was its potential to become infected. As such, Berengar had taken great preventative measures with repeated disinfectants and antibiotic ointment. If his wound were to become infected, the possibility of death was high, and as such, he wished to avoid such an outcome so early in life. After placing the ointment-covered bandage over Berengar's wounded eye, Berengar began to laugh bitterly as he decided to use his self-deprecating sense of humor to overcome the awkward silence. "I always thought I would look good with an eye patch." This caused Lind to chuckle as she hugged Berengar tightly and nodded while trying to comfort him. "If anything, it will add to your regal appearance." After saying those two remarks, the couple returned to awkward silence, where they sat still in the bedroom for a while. While Lind was greatly concerned about Berengar's injury, she was just grateful that he was still alive. After all, if the blade penetrated a little deeper into his eye, it could have killed him. Though she knew injury and death were possible on the battlefield, Berengar had always returned home in one piece in his previous campaigns. Because of this, there was a natural inclination to disregard the possibility. Yet here he was permanently injured from the battlefield. It caused her to be thankful that her man had survived, and as such, she desired to comfort him in his time of need. Berengar, however, saw this as a humbling experience, something from which he could learn a valuable lesson. After all, he still had one eye, thus, he could still function normally once he recovered. For the time being, Berengar would go through a phase of recovery. He would leave the realm's governance up to his Chancellor Liutbert and the rudimentary parliamentary system he had in place. At the moment, Berengar had two concerns, one of which regarded the construction of his new chalice. For the time being, he had no plans to inform Henrietta that Lambert had come to Tyrol to cause him harm. Instead, he would fabricate a letter from the Teutonic Order, informing the von Kufstein family of Lambert's death in a righteous crusade. His retired parents and little sister did not need to know of Lambert's actions or the fact that his skull had become Berengar's favorite drinking cup. The other concern was the construction of an exquisite eye patch. As such, he began to design a black velvet eye patch with golden embroidery that was sure to match his regal appearance perfectly. After it was complete, he sent the design to his tailors, who handcrafted the piece for him. The construction of his chalice and eye patch took a few days, and by the time Berengar received them, he was quite happy with the results. The skull chalice was hollowed out and dipped in gold, black garnet gemstones were encrusted below the lip of the cup, and at the bottom of the stand which protruded from the stem of the skull seamlessly, as if the entire piece was not actually made from a human skull, but carved out of a block of gold itself. The craftsmanship was of the highest quality, and Berengar was pleased with the result. As for the eye patch, it was exactly how he had envisioned and was also a work of art. The eye patch was an accessory that covered his hideously wounded eye, which had already begun to mend itself. Within a few weeks, the gash in the eye itself would be restored, but there would definitely be a scarred pupil and iris. As for the rest of the scar, parts of it were still visible above and below the eye patch, which Berengar felt gave him a dignified appearance. Overall, the wound did not take away from his appearance. If anything, it made him more striking and authoritative. Berengar was quite pleased with how it turned out. If he were wounded anywhere else on the face, his devilishly good looks would be affected. Lind, who was nearby, witnessed Berengar inspecting himself in the mirror and giggled as she watched the man she loved trying on his eye patch as if he was a teenage girl getting ready for a date. Noticing that his actions had been observed without his notice, Berengar decided to joke about the whole situation. "You are going to have to give me some notice in the future when you sneak up on me like that. My peripheral vision is not as great as it used to be." Hearing Berengar joke about his condition so casually made Lind feel less melancholy about his injury. Berengar had quickly accepted his fate and vowed to learn from the experience. Yet, Lind had spent the last few days sulking, as if she were the one wounded. After all, she felt as if what happened to Berengar also happened to her. As such, Berengar had spent most of his recovery comforting Lind, despite being the one injured himself. The hearts of women were a complex entity, and Berengar did his best to navigate its stormy seas. Yet, now that Berengar was displaying a smile on his face for the first time since his injury, Lind began to feel her spirit being lifted as well. As such, she began to smile warmly as she responded to Berengar's remarks. "I will consider that. How is your eye doing?" Berengar smiled as he looked at himself in the mirror. "It will be fine. It just needs a few more weeks of healing." As such, Berengar removed his eye patch and replaced it with a clean bandage. For now, the eye patch would have to wait. Despite how great it looked, healing was a greater priority than aesthetics. Ultimately, weeks went by, and Berengar had not informed Adela of his injury. Until he was fully healed, he would not worry the girl. After all, she might do something foolish like abscond from the safety of her family's castle and travel the roads by her lonesome to Kufstein during this dangerous era of civil strife. As such, he spent a great deal of time with Lind and their child Hans. Berengar was greatly pleased by the time he spent during the weeks of his recovery, as he was usually so dreadfully busy that he could not spend as much time with his family as he desired. The time he spent with his family was filled with bliss, and quite honestly, he was thankful for the reprieve from the hustle and bustle of the life of a tyrant. Things progressed smoothly in the realm, but ultimately he would have to cut his vacation short as the after-effects of the battle with the Teutonic Order were far greater than he had initially estimated. Chapter 157 Storm in the East. Weeks had gone by, and Berengar had fully recovered. However, at the other end of Europe in the east, the Teutonic Order was still attempting to accumulate its gains in the war with the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and yet, the Grand Master was currently reading a report in regards to the Battle of Oberstdorf in which Lambert fought with Berengar. The man was greatly frowning as he read the contents. One of his most promising talents, being Lambert, was dead, and 10,000 men with him. The results were disastrous. He was not expecting Berengar to field such a large and powerful army in such a short time. Then again, he was also not expecting Berniger to be the Count of Tyrol by the time Lambert's armies arrived. Too many things had happened between the time Lambert marched to war and the event of the battle itself. The result of the battle was a significant loss to the Teutonic Order. 10,000 men were no small number, and he was counting on many of those men to return and bolster their ranks to defend their territory. Now that the news of their defeat had spread, the Golden Horde, the sovereigns over the Grand Duchy of Moscow, had begun to move their armies to liberate the territory in which the Teutonic Order had annexed their conquest. There was no mistake. At any moment they could be facing the might of the Great Khanate, a war they could have been better off dealing with if they still had the 10,000 crusaders who embarked with Lambert. Not only was the East unstable, but the Grand Master was now facing pressure by the papacy to raise another army and invade Germany once more. The crusade to end Berengar's heresy had just begun in the eyes of Pope Simeon II. Yet the Grand Master had no intention of doing such things. If they could not defend their recently conquered regions, then what was the point of marching into the war zone known as Germany? In fact, Lambert was lucky not to get into conflict with the German armies currently fighting for the vacant throne. The messenger in which the Pope had sent to deliver his demands to the Grand Master was standing before him impatiently as he watched the Teutonic leader read through the reports of what had transpired, as well as the Vatican's demands. Eventually, the messenger could contain his eagerness no longer and asked what the Grand Master intended to do about the situation. The Pope demands a response to your order's loss in Oberstdorf. Berengar's victory will only further embolden the heretics who flock to his cause. If he can defy the might of the papacy without punishment, then why can't they? So what do you intend to do about this? The Grand Master glared at the messenger viciously before responding. I have already done enough. If Berengar could defeat an army of 30,000 men with half that amount, then it means he is not an opponent I can underestimate. The messenger was shocked that the Grand Master would praise Berengar's ability despite suffering massive losses against him. So much so that he foolishly condemned the Grand Master for his views. You compliment a condemned heretic? I am beginning to question your faith and that of your order. Hearing these words, the Grand Master turned around and grabbed the messenger of the Vatican by the throat with his hand and slammed him into the stone wall before chastising him. Listen here, you pompous twit. Tyrol is a mountainous region in which Berengar holds all of the advantages as the defender. The man has acquired a vast fortune, has he not? Who is to say that he is not using that fortune to construct defenses across its entirety, making it even more difficult to conquer? Do you fools in the Vatican have any idea what is going on in the Count's territory? I sent 10,000 battle-hardened veterans into Tyrol because you fools told me he was not a threat to worry about, and they are all dead now. The priest who acted as the messenger of the Vatican was so frightened by the fury of the Grand Master that he began to soil his tunic, which caused the Grand Master to release him in disgust. Afterward, he turned away, no longer facing the messenger before giving his decree. Return to the Vatican and ask His Holiness what he desires most of the Teutonic Order, to convert the Orthodox regions of the East to his domain, or to crush the heresy that has spread throughout the German-speaking regions? Because I cannot fulfill both of his requests at the same time. With this said, the priest from the Vatican fled the Grand Master's chambers and quickly left the castle of Malbork, where he intended to report back to Pope Simeon II as quickly as possible. After the messenger departed, the Grand Master sighed as he gazed into his fireplace and let out his thoughts. A storm is brewing in the East, and I do not have the time or resources to wage war against the various German powers. If the Pope is foolish enough to send me to Tyrol, then the East will be lost forever. Shortly after saying that, an order commander walked into his chambers with a report in his hands and announced his presence. Grand Master, may I have a moment of your time? The elderly leader of the Teutonic Order sighed before nodding his head, signaling for the commander to continue. The Golden Horde is on the move. They are laying siege to Moscow as we speak. With this news, his worst fears had been realized. The Grand Master responded to this information by sighing heavily before pulling out a flagon of wine and filling it into 2 chalices, one for himself and the other for the commander. After handing off one of the cups to the other man, he took a sip from his glass before expressing his thoughts. So it begins. If what the Teutonic commander had reported was true, the Order would have a difficult road ahead as they tried to defend the East from the Golden Horde's invasion. Now that they were down 10,000 men, it would not be an easy feat. On top of this new invasion from the East, they were currently fighting a war with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Their troops were stretched thin enough as it was. Yet Simeon still wanted him to waste time and effort on Tyrol. Judging from the expansion rate of Berengar's forces, it would not be long before such a war would be unwinnable for the Catholics. The Berengar heresy was likely to flourish in Germany as its tenets were appealing to the nobility and common folk alike. Now that the Golden Horde had invaded, it was no longer his concern. The papacy would have to find some other fool to wage that war. If only those French bastards had not dismantled the Templar Order, maybe they could have been the ones to bring the Church's justice to Berengar. All of these thoughts swirled in the mind of the Grand Master as he silently drank from his cup. When he was finished with the wine within, he tossed the chalice aside and instructed the commander of his orders. Alert the men. We ride for the East. Hopefully, the armies we have stationed there can hold off the enemy long enough for our reinforcements? After hearing this order, the commander was confused and, as such, attempted to clarify the issue at hand. And the Berengar heresy? The Grand Master grabbed a hold of his sword belt and tied it around his waist as he casually dismissed the issue. Let someone else deal with it. We have bled enough. With that said, the Teutonic Order completely disregarded the events in Oberstdorf and the defeat of Lambert and his army. After all, they had far more pressing concerns to attend to. As such, the Grand Master had begun to muster the forces in the westernmost region of the Teutonic state. The war in the east had begun, and they had limited time to make it before they were overwhelmed. It did not take long before the forces at Malbork had gathered and began to ride off into the east. The other armies of the Teutonic state would be mustered along the way. The Teutonic War against the Golden Horde had just begun, buying Berengar some much-needed time to build up his defenses. When Pope Simeon II heard that the Teutonic Order had snubbed him and marched to the east, he would be greatly infuriated. To enact his vengeance upon Berengar, he would need a new army to fight against him. Unfortunately for him, all of the Catholic military orders were currently undergoing some form of warfare, and the Byzantines to the east had already begun to form friendly ties with Berengar. As such, safety and security for the people of Tyrol had been secured for the time being. Something in which Berengar would take full advantage of to bring his vision of a fortified Tyrol into reality. When the Catholic Church could muster an army large enough to invade Tyrol, the region would be one giant self-sustaining fortress. Chapter 158. If you want peace, prepare for war. A month had passed since the battle with the Teutonic Order in Oberstdorf, and Berengar had spent much of this time as a much-needed vacation. His eye was fully healed aside from the fact that he was blind within it, and no longer presented a danger to his life. As such, he wore the luxurious eye patch he had created over the heavily scarred tissue. Overcoming the loss of an eye was not an easy task, and he needed to teach himself how to shoot and fight effectively with what used to be considered his offhand. As such, when he was not hard at work managing the realm's affairs, he was adapting to his circumstances. After being healed, he wrote a letter to Adela informing her of what had transpired and the injury in which he had suffered, though he assured her he was fully healed, and despite losing sight in his dominant eye, he was doing quite well for himself. He made sure to emphasize the need for her to stay safe in these troubled times, and as such, he implied to her not to do anything rash due to his injury. Before long, Berengar found himself looking at construction blueprints. After the battle with Lambert, several men had suffered grievous injuries, so much so that their bodies could not be identified, which reminded Berengar of the tomb of the unknown soldier in his previous life. Berengar decided to have a monument similar to that constructed within Kufstein to represent all of the unidentifiable soldiers who had perished in his wars, as well as those who might one day go missing in action. This was yet another of his many monuments that were undergoing construction. He had the wealth to splurge, so he felt it necessary to create a culture that honored their soldiers as early as possible. One day Germany would be united under a sense of militarism much like Prussia had done to the German Empire in his previous life's timeline. When Berengar met with the House of Lords to discuss his new monuments, they were happy to see him. Since his injury, he had seldom left his castle, and many of them were worried about his condition. After all, he had only left a bastard son behind, who was not legitimized yet. When they saw the eye patch on his face, they knew that he had suffered a permanent injury, and as such, took a moment of silence to commemorate his loss. Nevertheless, Berengar quickly managed to convince the nobleman to take action, and as such, he displayed his plans for a tomb of the unknown soldier for all to see. The design was essentially a rip-off of the American one, with the same words carved upon it, albeit slightly altered to fit his needs. Here lies in honored glory a German soldier, known but to God. One of the bodies of a soldier killed in the Battle of Oberstdorf who was unrecognizable would be interred within, and it would be a grand ceremony for all of Kufstein to be invited to attend. The cost of this monument would be significantly lower than the large bronze statues dedicated to different aspects of society that were currently undergoing production, such as the military, the labor force, and the agricultural force. It was a much more simplistic design, but it was because of this simplistic design that it was a beautiful monument in its own right. Seeing the depiction of the monument and its cost-effectiveness, the House of Lords held a vote for approval, which was merely a formalities sake at this point since Berengar's word was still the law in Tyrol, despite the drafting of a constitution. At the end of the day, a constitution was a piece of paper whose principles were only enforced through military might. Considering the military was a branch indoctrinated with loyalty towards Berengar and the von Kufstein dynasty, more so than the state itself, Berengar, in practice, wielded near absolute authority. Especially when the House of Commons and House of Lords were stacked with members Berengar approved of. After all, as the head of state, he reserved the right to dismiss anyone in Parliament and replace them with someone he saw fit. On paper, Tyrol was a semi-constitutional elective county, and as far as the people believed, this was true. In reality, it currently acted more like a dictatorship, albeit with an intricate and meritocratic bureaucracy. Berengar did not just appoint yes-men to their positions, they had to have been capable in their own right so that he may delegate responsibilities. He simply appointed capable men who were loyal to him, and at the moment, they were few and far between. As such, both the House of Commons and House of Lords were a fraction of the size they were intended to be. However, there were no complaints about the establishment of this monument, and it was met with a unanimous vote by both chambers of Parliament. After the vote was over, Arnulf, who was currently a member of the House of Lords, approached Berengar to check on his physical and mental health. "Your Excellency, I was wondering how are you holding up?" Berengar smiled and clasped Arnulf on the shoulder in a friendly gesture. "I am doing well, despite losing the sight in my right eye. You could say I am quickly adapting to my circumstances, even if it is a bit tedious using my offhand for everything." Arnulf smiled when he heard the good news and began to make small talk with Berengar about current events. "Your Excellency, have you heard about the recent events in the East?" Berengar had been on vacation until recently and had not yet heard about what had happened. As such, he gazed at Arnulf with an inquisitive gaze and asked about what he was referring to. "I'm afraid I am unaware. Why did something important happen?" Arnulf was sure that Berniger had spent the last month spending quality time with his family, and in his opinion, the young count deserved a break for once. The man was practically working himself to death every day. As such, he was not shocked to know that Berengar was not informed of the current happenings in Eastern Europe. Thus he elected to inform him. The Golden Horde has attacked the Teutonic state, and in response, the Order has marched their armies to the east in an attempt to hold onto the territory they have gained against the Muscovites. It appears the loss of Lambert and his men has greatly affected their fighting capability. Berengar chuckled lightly when he heard this before expressing his views. "Good, that ought to keep them busy for some time. It gives us a much-needed reprieve so that we can focus on constructing our defenses and implementing our industrial and agricultural reforms." Arnulf agreed wholeheartedly with this statement, and as such, he began to question Berengar's plans for the future. After all, Berengar had not shared with many people his vision for a unified German Empire, and he could not help but notice the monument said, "German soldier," instead of Tyrolean soldier. "So tell me, what do you think Duke Wilmar's chances of winning this war is?" Berengar scoffed at the idea before saying the objective truth or what he thought it to be. I do not bother speculating about the future, Lord Arnulf, for the future is malleable from what we do here and now. However, I have a suspicion that the ultimate winner of this chaotic era will be a man that the higher nobility least expects. Someone who will take advantage of the weakened factions towards the end of the war to become the victor. Hearing Berengar's thoughts on the matter left Arnulf with a lot of speculation. However, Berengar had not outright admitted it. It sounded to Arnulf like the young count had lofty ambitions, and something deep inside his mind told him it was entirely plausible for Berengar to achieve these things. After all, the young man went from being Baron's son and heir to a count in roughly a year. He had stood beside Berengar as he went through this monumental transition and knew now that Tyrol's security was ensured. Berengar would undoubtedly focus on rebuilding the army and constructing defenses across the region. If the peace in Tyrol could last, Berengar would ultimately be in such a position towards the end of the war, one in which he could reap the spoils. Of course, as Berengar had stated earlier, time was malleable, and the future was uncertain. It might be possible for an event to occur in the near future which could drag Berengar into this massive conflict far earlier than he expected. Or things could go exactly how Berengar planned. The only entity who could know the future was God, assuming he really existed. As such, Berengar stayed with the House of Lords for the rest of his day's work, overseeing his plans for military expansion and defensive spending. The budget he had outlined perfectly took into account all of their current assets and the potential for future growth with the trade to the Byzantine Empire. Peace is always temporary, and Berengar planned to take full advantage of the time he had. As the old Roman adage stated, si vis pacem, para bellum, in translation, if you want peace, prepare for war. Chapter 159 Council of Kufstein. With the Teutonic Order's defeat in Oberstdorf, Berengar's fame had increased exponentially. The fact that he resisted such a massive army and dealt a devastating blow to the Crusaders who invaded Germany at the behest of the Pope to put down the so-called Berengar heresy had emboldened Berengar's followers. The town of Soule and the destruction wrought upon it by the papacy's forces became a symbol of resistance against papal authority. As a result, noblemen and clergy alike flocked to Kufstein to discuss the details of the German Reformation and how to proceed. While Berengar entertained these delegates inside his great hall, he merely sat upon his seat of power with his skull chalice in his hands, drinking from wine as he listened to the noblemen and clergy squabble over the direction in which this reformist movement should take. At the moment, there was a significant figure of the Catholic Church present, and that was the old and wise cardinal who had tried to mend the divide in the Catholic Church at the meeting of the Council of Constance the year before. After seeing what Simeon and his French counterpart had done to the Catholic Church, the old cardinal decided to throw his lot in with Berengar. At the moment, he was closely observing Berengar's actions. He was quite shocked to see that Berengar was allowing the discussion to take its course naturally, rather than enforcing his views onto everyone else. While the Prince Bishop of Chur and the Count of Vorarlberg were debating over the degree to which the church should separate themselves, Berengar watched calmly as if all his plans were going smoothly. Eventually, the Prince Bishop of Chur made a bold declaration for the entire council to hear. I will gladly give up my authority over Chur in favor of a like-minded nobleman. The church should focus on the spiritual affairs of God, and not the mortal affairs of men. With this said, a smirk spread across Berengar's lips as he witnessed the scene coming to fruition. A powerful prince bishop would take the lead and dissolve the church's authority over the region of Chur, one of his neighbors, in favor of a German-speaking reformist nobleman. It was certainly a bold declaration. Nevertheless, this would be the key to conquering the Swiss Confederacy and incorporating it into his empire in the future, and as such, Berengar was very pleased. However, that was a plot for another time. Now, he needed to solidify the foundation for his reformation. Ultimately, the topic of the separation of church and state was practically universally agreed upon by the people in the room, and the reason for the debate was more of a border squabble between Chur and Vorarlberg than it was religious. Thus, when the men continued to argue over such irrelevant things, Berengar grunted in displeasure, which instantly silenced the two parties. After which the subject of the council moved on to the next point of contention. The next item on the menu was the question of clerical celibacy, which sparked an enormous debate. After all, there were plenty of sex scandals in the church, even during the medieval period. However, Berengar knew exactly what maintaining celibacy could lead to and was against such a point. While the people were arguing over which option their reformist movement should take, Berengar spoke up for the first time during the meeting. The moment he did so, everyone stood in silence, listening to his words, which were not his own, but those from the gospel. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, and doctrines of devils. Speaking lies in hypocrisy. Having their conscience seared with a hot iron. Forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. Every creature of God is good, and nothing to be refused, if received with thanksgiving. For it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. 1 Timothy chapter 4 verses 1-5. When the room heard these words, they knew exactly what Berengar meant. The Gospel states that actions such as celibacy and refusing to eat meat as well as some of the other Catholic practices were against the teachings of the apostles and Christ himself. In particular, the old cardinal, who had been waiting for Berengar's input, was shocked when he heard Berengar quote the Bible so perfectly, even memorizing the exact verse. Finally, the old man spoke up as well. I agree with Berengar, if we are to take the words of Christ and the apostles as the basis for the Reformation, then prohibiting the marriage of the clergy, and forcing them to take vows of celibacy is against the teachings of Christ and should not be enforced. Hearing both Berengar, who was at the head of the Reformation, and a high-ranking member of the current church both agree on the matter, those who doubted the validity of such a concept before now found themselves nodding their heads in approval. For on the topic of spirituality, who could argue with the words of the gospel? Berengar nodded at the cardinal, whom he had been aware was watching him closely this entire time. Truthfully, Berengar did not know if the man was an infiltrator of the papacy or if he was as irritated with the church's behavior as Berengar was. However, with his endorsement on this matter, he began to suspect the man was genuinely pious and cared more for the teachings of Christ than the power of the papacy. A trait that was exceptionally rare in a man of his position during this era. After concluding that topic, it came down to another important aspect of Christian Reformation, which was salvation and how it was achieved. One of the priests present, an elderly man with a lengthy white beard, made his opinion on the matter known. Through a life of good works and faith in God is the path in which one enters the gates of heaven. However, another priest was in firm disagreement over this regard and voiced his concern. The Bible teaches us that it is through faith in Christ alone that one achieves eternal life. The two priests began to butt heads, which was a common occurrence in any religious discussion, and as such, Berengar voiced his opinion on the matter. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8-9. After saying this, Berengar once more was able to garner the attention of everyone present. As such, he quickly followed his thought. It is through the Bible, not the traditions of the Catholic Church, which our Reformation should be based upon, and because the Bible teaches us that only through faith in Christ shall we enter through the gates of heaven, then it must be so. Through Berengar's interruption, these two issues were eventually settled into an agreement. Through faith, one gains salvation, not action, and the fact that religious truth stems from the Bible, not the teachings of the Catholic Church. After giving such information, the final argument for the basis of their Reformation came down to the Eucharist, and Berengar personally did not care in the slightest for this issue. As a closet atheist, how the Reformists viewed the Eucharist or communion as some branches of Christianity referred to it in his previous life had absolutely no bearing on his political authority. As such, the men present argued among themselves until finally it was agreed upon that the Eucharist represented both the body and blood of Christ, but also the bread and wine. With all of these major points of contention ironed out, the First Council of the German Reformist Church was concluded, and though there would be more later in life. The split in the Catholic Church, which had been prevented for so long in this timeline, finally occurred. With the endorsement of the wise cardinal who formerly sat upon the Council of Constance, German reformism had come into existence, bringing a further degree of civil strife to Germany as reformists and Catholics would soon begin to split the already fragile duchies apart. The wise cardinal was aware the entire time of what Berengar's plans were. After the meeting was over and the Reformation had been decided, he approached Berengar to talk with him about his plans for the future personally. Seeing the wise old man come to him directly, Berengar felt cautious at first and raised his hand, signaling the old man to maintain his distance. "Cardinal, is there something I can help you with?" The cardinal smiled amicably at Berengar. though behind his kind smile was a face filled with a degree of weariness similar in level to Berengar. As such, he began to speak to the man who he knew was bound to change the world. "I must say I am impressed." Finding the cryptic message amusing, Berengar decided to take the bait. The man stood several feet away from Berengar, who was currently seated in his position of power. As such, there was ample space to prevent any threat. Of course, Berengar's guards were on watch and would have no problem slaying the cardinal if he made a move on Berengar's life. Luckily for everyone in the room, he had no such intentions. In my many years, I have met kings and emperors, and plenty of them. Yet none of them have had the ability to influence the church as you have. Within a single year, you have climbed from the position of a lowly baron's son to that of an influential count whose arms and armor are sold to every corner of Germany, supplying the factions who vie for the vacant throne. Yet during this time, you also managed to inspire a schism in the church, the likes which I fear we have never seen before. Tell me truthfully, Berengar, are you an angel sent here by God to liberate us from the shackles of the church's corruption? Or are you a demon whose sole purpose is to benefit from the chaos and destruction that you leave in your wake? Berengar studied the man's words carefully. He knew very well that the old cardinal was not literally asking if he was an angel or a demon, but which side his character reflected. Berengar played with Lambert's skull for a few moments with his fingers before taking a sip out of its contents. Afterward, he exhaled deeply. After careful consideration, Berengar had decided to tell the old man the truth. After all, he could tell by the way in which he had voiced the question that he had already seen through Berengar's plans. "Can't I be both?" The old cardinal's smile never disappeared, and instead, he turned around and walked away, saying his thoughts on the matter before walking out the door. After all, he had received a satisfying answer to his question. Well played.